Hi guys. Tonight we step into a winter that would probably finish you off in a single night if you were left outdoors with nothing but your modern fleece jacket. Imagine snow heaped like white waves against bark walls, the forest groaning under the weight of ice, and the river frozen stiff as glass. You pull your shoulders tighter against the chill, because this is the world of the Longhouse, a wooden ribcage of a building where dozens of people huddle together, somehow not turning into frozen statues by dawn. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you do, post your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing who's still awake out there. Now, dim the lights. You trudge toward the Longhouse, and the first thing that hits you is the bulk of it. These aren't cozy cabins. They stretch out like ships run aground, 60 or even 100 feet long. The Iroquois Confederacy alone built some so vast you'd wonder whether they were meant for humans or giants. Wooden poles rise like ribs, bent inward and lashed, then clad in overlapping slabs of elm bark. Snow presses against those bark panels, and you hear them creak and snap, but the walls hold. That's the first miracle. No matter how much snow dumps overnight, you're inside something that won't just collapse and bury you alive. The second miracle is the faint glow that leaks through cracks near the roof. Fires flicker in the center aisle, small and smoky, but steady. Without them, this whole place would be nothing more than a frozen tomb. Archaeologists agree that longhouses used central hearths lined up in a row, each one belonging to a pair of families. A mainstream fact is that among the Haudenosaunee, several nuclear families formed what they called a clan, and that clan claimed a stretch of hearth and bunks within a shared longhouse. The fire is both literal and symbolic, keeping you warm and tying you into a network of relatives who will notice if you stop breathing in the night. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Snow sometimes became part of the insulation. When storms raged, families didn't scrape it away, but let drifts pile high against the outside walls, like nature's own blanket. It sounds counterintuitive. You think snow equals cold, but snow is mostly air trapped in ice crystals. That dead air layer clings to the bark and slows the brutal wind. If you've ever built a snow fort as a kid, you know it can feel surprisingly snug. So in a way, the very storm that terrified you on the path over is now helping to keep the Longhouse cozy. Still, historians dispute just how cozy it really was. Some researchers suggest the temperature inside hovered just above freezing, barely enough to stop frostbite. Others claim that with bodies packed in, fires stoked, and hides layered thick, the interior could feel genuinely warm, maybe even too hot for comfort. People might have stripped off outer furs to nap in shirts of soft skin. Scholars still argue whether longhouses were drafty barns or surprisingly efficient heaters. You'll probably never get a precise thermometer reading, just accounts filtered through memory, archaeology, and the smell of charred wood. Your nose wrinkles at that smell now. Smoke fills the air, thick enough that you cough and rub your eyes. Longhouses weren't ventilated like your house. They had smoke holes above each hearth, little vents in the roof, but whether they drew well depended on the wind. Sometimes the whole place filled like a giant pipe, and people had to lie low, breathing near the floor to avoid stinging eyes. Maybe you wonder, wouldn't that smoke suffocate you overnight? And yet, paradoxically, it's part of what saves you. Smoke kills fleas and lice, deters mice, even keeps some disease vectors at bay. It also dries meat and hides hung overhead. So yes, your lungs burn a bit, but without that haze, you might wake up itchier, hungrier, and colder. The soundscape adds to your strange comfort. Beyond the walls, you hear wolves howling in the forest, but inside, it's the rhythm of snores, the pop of sap in the firewood, the faint creak of timbers expanding and contracting. Children murmur in dreams, elders clear throats, and sometimes someone laughs softly at a story told before bed. All these noises blend into a lullaby of survival. You're not alone. You're part of a human furnace. You run your hand along the inner wall. It's rough, splintered bark, but warmer than you expect. Behind it lies stuffing bundles of reeds or moss jammed into seams to block drafts. It's not perfect. You still feel a whisper of icy air snake in. But compared to outside, it's heaven. The whole structure breathes with its occupants, sighing out smoke, drawing in just enough oxygen to keep you alive. And when you finally lie down, stretching out on a raised wooden bunk lined with woven mats, you realize the genius of it. You're off the frozen ground, tucked beneath a layer of hides, with bodies pressed nearby. You're wrapped in a bubble of shared human determination. Outside, snow pounds the bark like drums. Inside, the bark holds. That's how you sleep, not in comfort as you know it, but in a rough, smoky, miraculous warmth carved out of the forest. The hearth fires flicker low in the darkness, painting the longhouse in stripes of orange and shadow. You rub your arms and notice the way each flame licks at the logs like a hungry tongue, steady but fragile. Without these small fires, everyone here would be lost to the cold by morning. The longhouse is not one single fireplace, but a series of them, spaced carefully down the center aisle, each claimed by a family. Step too close and you feel the heat flare. Step back and you're in the chill again, like islands of warmth strung along a frozen river. A mainstream fact is that these hearths serve double duty, cooking and heating. Archaeologists find long rows of blackened soil in old village sites, traces of these fireplaces. Food and survival were inseparable from warmth. A pot of corn soup bubbling quietly gave off both nourishment and steam, the two things your body craves most when the night claws at you with icy fingers. You don't just eat the warmth, you breathe it. The quirky part comes when you look upward. Smoke doesn't just vanish. It has to go somewhere. Longhouses had smoke holes cut in the bark roof, a practical solution that was never quite perfect. You see faint beams of starlight stabbing down, where the vent lets out smoke and, inconveniently, lets in snow. Families had to manage those holes carefully, sometimes adjusting bark slabs or even plugging gaps when storms grew wild. Imagine being assigned smoke hole duty, your nightly chore to poke a stick at a flapping bark flap above your head. Not exactly glamorous, but without it, everyone might choke in their sleep. And here's where historians disagree. Some suggest these smoke vents worked surprisingly well, creating a draft that pulled air up and out like a chimney. Others insist the opposite, that longhouses often filled with haze so thick you could hardly see the rafters. One researcher even speculated that children and elders suffered constant coughs from smoky lungs. Scholars remain divided over whether longhouse life was bearably smoky or nearly unlivable. You lean back and cough into your sleeve, wondering which version feels more true. Still, smoke adds a sensory layer you can't ignore. The air is heavy, yet oddly soothing, like incense in a cathedral. It settles on your skin, clings to your hair, and stains your clothes until you carry the scent everywhere. Maybe that's the point your smell becomes inseparable from your shelter, like a badge of belonging. Strangers approaching the village could be identified by scent alone, longhouse smoke or the clean bite of winter air. Listen closely, and you notice the fires talk to you. Each crackle, each hiss, is a tiny reassurance that the wood still burns. The embers glow like eyes, watching over the sleepers curled nearby. People learn to read those sounds instinctively. A sharp pop means sap exploding. A soft crumble means the log is hollowing out. The fire is alive, and you, in turn, are alive because of it. One little detail, quirky but practical, is how carefully families rationed fuel. You picture yourself dragging in armloads of firewood before nightfall, stacking it like treasure near your hearth. Running out midwinter wasn't just inconvenient, it was deadly. Some oral traditions recall people burning bark stripped from trees or even dismantling abandoned structures when supplies ran short. You can almost hear the quiet groan of someone rising in the dark to add one more stick to the flames, muttering about how stingy the woodpile looks. Your skin warms on one side and chills on the other. Fires in longhouses weren't roaring bonfires but modest, controlled blazes. Too large, and they would send sparks into bark walls or dry mats, with catastrophic results. Too small, and the cold would creep back in, stiffening fingers and toes. Finding the balance was a nightly act of judgment. Now imagine lying down, the fire low, smoke rising lazily to the roof, your eyes half close as sparks float upward like fireflies. You know you're safe, not because the fire eliminates cold, but because it tames it just enough for your body to rest. Beyond the walls, winter rages. Inside, the hearth burns on, stubborn as you. You ease yourself onto one of the sleeping platforms, and the difference is immediate. Raised bunks run along both sides of the longhouse, wooden planks braced into the walls, their height a clever trick to escape the cold grip of the ground. You notice that the lowest air always feels the coldest, just like modern campers know. Cold sinks, warmth rises. By climbing onto these platforms, you lift yourself into the gentler layer where heat lingers. A mainstream fact stands here plain as the plank beneath you. Longhouses typically featured 2 or even 3 tiers of sleeping shelves, stacked like giant bunk beds. Families with status or elders often claimed the middle height, neither too near the icy floor nor too close to the smoke drifting beneath the roof. Everyone knew their place, not just socially but spatially, marked out along these timber ledges. Quirky detail? Some mats were woven of bulrush or cattail, plants pulled from marshes and dried until they made springy bedding. Imagine lying on a mattress of pond weeds, not luxurious by your standards, but once softened by animal hides. It gave just enough cushion to keep hips from bruising on the boards. In fact, some travelers reported that these beds were surprisingly comfortable, springy, warm, and even fragrant with the sweet grass sometimes mixed in. Your hand brushes the wall behind you, where bundles of reeds and moss stuff every seam. Cold still whispers through tiny cracks, but the layered construction makes this raised corner almost snug. Families added layers of furs, deer, beaver, sometimes even bear, until you could sink into them like a cocoon. You tuck yourself under one now, and the musty smell of hides, mixed with wood smoke, becomes oddly soothing. Historians still puzzle over just how effective these raised bunks were. Some argue they were essential, keeping sleepers dry and significantly warmer. Others point out that with dozens of people crowded together, rising body heat alone might have done most of the work, and the bunk height mattered less. Still, archaeological digs uncover wear marks on those high platforms, telling us people did indeed climb up nightly, proving the design wasn't just for storage. Above your head, the rafters hold baskets, dried fish, and corn, all dangling where smoke can preserve them. That arrangement means you're half sleeping in a pantry, lulled by the faint rattle of kernels shifting in their husks. If you're hungry, the smell of drying meat torments you, but it also reassures you this longhouse has food enough to last the cold months. The air carries a quiet chorus, the creak of wood, the sighs of kin settling into place, the muffled bark of a dog outside. You press your ear against the fur and realize how insulated you truly are. The raised bunk isolates you from the frozen ground. The mats soften the wood, the hides trap the heat, and the bodies around you radiate warmth like living coals. Still, nothing here resembles the privacy you're used to. You share this shelf with siblings, cousins, maybe a grandmother snoring steadily by your ear. Privacy was a luxury nobody considered essential. Survival was the shared blanket, the common breath, the collective heat. You might grumble at an elbow in your ribs, but you'd rather that than waking up frozen stiff on the floor. As you drift towards sleep, you feel grateful for the raised platform beneath you, simple boards that separate life from death. Outside, the ground could freeze a spilled bucket of water solid. Inside, the bunk holds you just high enough to stay human through the night. You shift slightly on your platform, and suddenly you feel the weight of bodies pressing in close. The longhouse was never a place of sprawling personal space, it was a human quilt. You tuck yourself nearer, shoulder against shoulder, hip against hip, and realize how practical this was. One reliable observation from anthropologists is that communal sleeping arrangements were not just about companionship, they were essential insulation. In winter, every breath and every heartbeat became another layer of heat for the person beside you. You might imagine penguins huddling in the Antarctic, trading spots on the icy edge. The principle here was much the same, though wrapped in bark walls and fur blankets rather than feathers. If you've ever camped with friends and found that a tent of 3 people warms faster than a tent of 1, you already know the trick. Multiply that by 20 or 30 sleepers, and you begin to understand how a longhouse, smoky and crowded as it was, created its own microclimate. Some early European visitors remarked on how stifling the atmosphere could get, so much so that you'd strip off a layer or two despite the snowstorm howling outside. That wasn't comfort in the modern sense, but survival didn't require comfort, just warmth. Here's a curious aside. Some sources recall that couples often slept pressed tight under a single hide, and children wedged in along the flanks. The warmth of intimacy wasn't simply emotional, it was thermal engineering. Infants and toddlers rarely lay alone. They were tucked between parents or grandparents, bodies forming a fortress of flesh against the cold. In fact, travelers sometimes expressed shock at the lack of what they considered proper spacing, but to the families within, distance meant danger. A baby separated by even a few inches might lose crucial heat before dawn. And yet, scholars differ when they reconstruct how close these sleeping arrangements really were. Some argue the platforms were divided into family compartments with hides strung up like curtains, granting a little privacy. Others suggest that privacy was largely abandoned in favor of mass survival. Conflicting reports survive, leaving modern researchers to puzzle over how people balanced the need for warmth with the desire for personal space. You can almost picture the bickering even now. One person begging for elbow room, another snapping back that elbow room doesn't keep toes from freezing. The scents of humanity are thick in here, sweat, smoke, and the faint musky note of animal hide. It's not sterile, but it's oddly grounding. You breathe it in and recognize that this is the smell of endurance. Without deodorant, showers, or ventilation, the air becomes its own body, heavy but alive. In a strange way, that smell tells you you're still among the living. Close contact also shaped social bonds. You didn't just hear your cousin's stories by firelight, you felt their breath stir the fur on your cheek as you drifted into dreams. Arguments couldn't last long when you were forced to roll over into the same blanket by nightfall. And secrets were thin things here. The whole household knew who cried in their sleep, who muttered prayers, who kicked restlessly through the night. In that sense, the longhouse was as much a crucible for community as it was a defense against frost. Imagine the sounds, the slow collective breathing, a baby's soft whimper, the shuffle of someone adjusting hides, a cough rattling from one corner. Each sound bounces off the bark and reads until it becomes part of a nightly symphony. The constant noise reassures you silence would mean something is terribly wrong. There's an offbeat detail, travelers noted. Sometimes families trained their dogs to leap onto the sleeping platforms too. The dogs curled against ankles or sprawled at the edges, extra bundles of living heat. Their fur collected embers of warmth from the fire, and their presence reassured children frightened by the howling wind outside. You feel a cold nose nudge at your toes now, and instead of annoyance, you sigh in relief. This little creature is a heating stone wrapped in fur, and it belongs as much to the longhouse as the timbers themselves. Not everyone found comfort in this closeness. Some accounts describe outbreaks of quarrels sparked by sheer crowding arguments over who hogged more hides, who coughed too loudly, or whose feet strayed into another's ribs. But even through bickering, people returned night after night to the same tight quarters. Discomfort was tolerated because the alternative was unthinkable. Better to endure a sibling's snores than the frozen indifference of the forest. The truth is that every inch of this closeness reflects adaptation. Modern readers might cringe at the lack of privacy, but survival rearranges your priorities. You wonder what you would trade: the tidy solitude of your own room, or the steady warmth of 10 human furnaces pressed around you. As your body relaxes into the shared cocoon, you realize the answer is already made for you. The snow outside may rage, but in here, humanity becomes a blanket thicker than any fur. So you close your eyes, wedged between kin, shoulder to shoulder, and you understand, survival in the Longhouse was never an individual accomplishment. It was a group performance, a nightly collaboration, a communal heartbeat that kept winter at bay. You stir awake in the darkness, shifting under the heavy weight of hides. The Longhouse is never silent. Embers snap, a baby fusses softly, and somewhere a dog shakes its fur, sending a little shiver down the planks. You tug the coverings higher over your shoulders and think about what these blankets really are. Not cloth, not feather duvets, but animal skins layer after layer of deer, elk, beaver, even bear hides stacked thick against the cold. One detail historians emphasize is the sheer reliance on pelts. Long before Europeans arrived with woven cloth and wool, people had already perfected the art of using animal skins for insulation. Skins weren't just coverings, they were multi-purpose survival tools, shelters, mats, coats, and of course blankets. The warmth in your bones right now is thanks to the animal that once roamed these same forests. What's striking, though, is how hides were used beyond mere blankets. Families stretched them against inner walls to stop drafts, hung them as partitions for privacy, or draped them across doorways to serve as thick flaps. You can almost see someone tacking up an extra bear hide over a seam where wind whistled through. Practicality shaped the aesthetic. Every visible surface layered with fur until the entire interior looked like the inside of a giant pelt shop. Here's a curious tidbit you might not expect. Certain furs were prized for how they felt as much as for their warmth. Beaver pelts were soft and supple, ideal for wrapping children. Bear hides, heavier and musky, were seen as protective and even powerful. Some oral traditions suggest sleeping beneath a bear's pelt carried spiritual strength, as though the animal's endurance rubbed off on you. Picture a child cocooned in fur, told by a grandparent that the bear's spirit would keep nightmares away. The blanket was both insulation and talisman. Not everyone agrees on how widespread certain pelts were. Scholars examining burial goods and trade records debate whether bear hides, for instance, were common bedding or reserved for special individuals. Some argue that the bulk and scarcity of bear skins made them impractical for everyday use, while others point to repeated references in oral accounts that suggest they were indeed nightly companions in many households. The truth may never be fully settled, but the image lingers of families enveloped in the layered strength of the creatures they hunted. You run your hand over one of these hides and feel its textures: rough outer hair, smoother under fur, and the faint oiliness that never quite washes out. The smell is earthy, a reminder of the wilderness pressed into service inside your home. The hides creak as you shift them, heavy enough to feel like another body lying on top of you. Blankets weren't the only way animal parts contributed to warmth. Tanned skins sometimes doubled as floor mats, insulating the bunks from cold drafts that swept along the planks. Hides strung between poles could form makeshift barriers, turning one big communal hall into segmented alcoves where smaller groups could sleep. Even stretched stomach linings from larger animals were occasionally used as translucent panels to block wind while letting in filtered light. Ingenuity had no waste. Imagine the nightly routine: hides shaken out, rearranged, tucked around children. Someone fusses to make sure a flap covers exposed toes. Another pulls a heavy pelt over the group as though sealing in coals. Once settled, the blankets don't just warm you, they pin you, forcing you into stillness. Perhaps that's part of why sleep came swiftly. Once you were under the hides, moving was too much trouble. Dogs nose around, curling up on the edges of blankets where heat leaks. They bury themselves partly under the skins, accepted guests in this layered fortress. Their presence adds to the sense that these furs represent more than just fabric. They are a living continuity between animal, human, and the spirit world of survival. There's something oddly modern in this too. You might think of weighted blankets that people use today for comfort and anxiety relief. Those ancient piles of hides offered the same heaviness, pressing you into calm. No one in the Longhouse called it therapy, but the effect would have been familiar, a dense, embracing weight that quieted your body. Yet you can't ignore the challenges. Hides grew stiff with age, sometimes cracking if not properly oiled. They absorbed smoke and sweat until their smell turned rank. Bugs nested in the fur unless smoke from the fire drove them off. Maintenance was constant scraping, softening, replacing. Families worked as much to keep their blankets functional as to keep them warm. Still, the hides outlasted countless winters. And as you breathe in their scent now, you realize they embody the entire survival strategy. To take what the land gives, to stretch its gifts across walls, doors and beds until winter is caged outside. Without these animals, the Longhouse would be nothing but a wooden skeleton against the snow. With them, it becomes a living, breathing den warm enough that you too might just drift off to sleep despite the blizzard outside. You lie awake, staring into the dark curve of the Longhouse wall. The fire's glow has dwindled, leaving only a faint shimmer of embers, and you begin to notice how much thought went into these walls themselves. They aren't simply bark slapped onto poles, they're layers, stuffed, packed, and tended with precision. You run your hand along the inner surface and feel how uneven it is, bark slabs overlapping, seams pressed tight, and here and there the scratchy softness of reeds or moss jammed into cracks. Archaeological surveys and surviving accounts agree on one steady fact. The outer bark covering wasn't enough by itself. Cold winds sliced through any gap, and rain or snow would creep in. To fight that, families lined the seams with plant matter. Cattail fluff was a favorite, gathered in autumn and stored for exactly this purpose. Dried moss or bulrushes worked too. Stuffed into the cracks, they created little air pockets, nature's insulation. Modern scientists point out that this layering acts much like fiberglass batting in today's houses. The principle is identical. Trap air, slow heat loss, keep the inside a little more bearable. And yet, here's an unusual detail that makes you smile. Cattail fluff wasn't only insulation, it was also tinder. People could scrape a bit of it loose, and it caught fire instantly with the tiniest spark. Imagine the paradox, your walls lined with material that both saved you from freezing and could set the whole place ablaze if you weren't careful. This is survival engineering at its riskiest. A family might patch a drafty seam in the afternoon, then hours later scrape that same seam for a quick fire-starting puff. You can almost hear someone muttering, "Just don't mix up which pile is for stuffing and which is for lighting." Experts don't always agree on how effective this wall packing really was. Some argue that a Longhouse, even insulated, never rose above chilly temperatures, think sweater weather rather than cozy warmth. Others suggest that once every seam was stuffed and fires maintained, the interior could hold heat remarkably well, sometimes too well, creating an oppressive stuffiness. Reconstructions built in the modern era show both possibilities. Some leak like sieves, others trap warmth until you sweat. The debate lingers, leaving you to wonder what version you're experiencing tonight as you press your palm against the rough bark. Still, your senses confirm the benefit. Where moss is stuffed thick, the wall feels almost soft, like a padded surface. The air near it is still, without the icy draft that sneaks through gaps left bare. You remember walking past newer structures outside simple lean-tos or single-family huts and realizing how much more wind cut through them. Compared to those, the Longhouse is a fortress. Not perfect, not cozy, but far superior when the snow stacks high. Imagine the seasonal rhythm that made this possible. Families spent autumn harvesting reeds and cattails, drying them carefully, bundling them in heaps. Children likely joined in, stuffing the light, fluffy material into sacks or baskets. The same children now crawl along the walls in winter, poking tufts into holes while their elders direct them. Survival was never just adult work. It was a household performance, every hand, small or large, contributing. The smell of the stuffing adds another sensory layer. Moss holds a damp, earthy aroma, faintly sweet and forest-like. Reeds, once dried, give off a grassy scent. In the smoky chamber, these smells mingle until the entire house carries the perfume of wetlands mixed with wood smoke. Close your eyes, and it's like the whole environment is pressed indoors. Swamp, forest, river, all brought together to guard your sleep. Of course, maintenance was constant. Winds tugged bark loose, rodents chewed at the stuffing, and rain dampened the seams. A daily routine might involve someone circling the interior, finger-testing cracks, jamming more moss where the cold breathed through. It's not glamorous work, but it's what kept children from shivering too hard at night. A little oddity turns up in some oral accounts. Families sometimes smeared mud or clay into cracks for extra sealing. That hardened into crusts, almost like primitive caulking. Clay blocked wind well, though it also crumbled with time, needing replacement. Some modern reconstructions that tried this discovered it not only worked, but also lent the house a slightly different acoustics. The walls muffled sounds, so that the interior felt quieter, hushed under its earthy skin. You can picture villagers sitting back and noticing the muffled storm outside, their voices swallowed into warmth by the very mud they had plastered. Looking upward, you see how the roof, too, benefited from layers. Overlapping bark shingles, sometimes weighed down by poles, shed snow like scales. Any gap left open could be stuffed from inside. You trace one of those seams with your eyes, watching faint moonlight filter through, and think of the endless hours spent weaving nature into something greater than itself. And though debate continues about how effective all this stuffing truly was, one thing is certain. Without it, the longhouse would have been a leaky, miserable barn. With it, even in the harshest storms, families could breathe, sleep, and live without turning to stone. You lean back, brushing your hand over the moss-packed seam again, and realize you're touching the very line between survival and surrender. The wind outside roars, the bark creaks, but within these stuffed seams, the air stays calmer, the warmth lingers longer, and you wedged under hides, surrounded by kin, can finally exhale without seeing your breath freeze in front of your face. The night stretches on, and your attention drifts toward the longhouse entrance. In daylight it looks simple, a low oval opening cut into the bark walls, covered by a flap of woven mat or hide. But at night, in the coldest hours, that flap becomes the gate between life and death. The longhouse is only as warm as its weakest seam, and the doorway is always the first suspect. One thing that early observers consistently noticed is how these entrances were engineered like cold traps. They weren't tall or wide like a modern door. Instead, they sat low, forcing you to duck and stoop every time you entered. That wasn't clumsy design. It was practical physics. Cold air sinks and rushes through gaps at ground level. A small, narrow entrance minimized the flow, and a flap of fur or bark mat added one more barrier. Step through quickly, drop the flap, and the house's fragile pocket of warmth stayed intact. And there's an offbeat little note here. Some households hung multiple layers of coverings, like curtains in succession. You'd push through a fur hide, then another mat, then finally emerge inside. Travelers wrote about feeling like they were squeezing through a beast's throat, spat out from cold to warmth. You can imagine the awkward shuffle of guests wrestling their way past clinging mats while someone inside shouted, "Close it quick! You're letting the heat out!" Some things never change. Not every scholar agrees on how standard these multiple flaps were. Archaeological remains of door frames are rare, and oral accounts vary. Some researchers argue that most longhouses had only a single mat per door, while others believe 2 or even 3 were common in harsher climates. Without conclusive evidence, the debate lingers. The truth may depend on region, season, or even the wealth of the household. Still, the mental picture of layered portals persists, primitive airlocks that protected the warmth within. You crouch at the doorway now, brushing your hand against the flap. It's thick, heavy with smoke residue, stiff with frost along the edges. Push it aside, and you feel the icy draft instantly sharp, invasive, a reminder of what waits outside. Close it again, and the longhouse exhales with relief, like a body pulling its blanket back into place. Inside, the flap isn't just insulation. It's also a threshold of etiquette. Visitors announce themselves with a call before entering, then duck low in respect as much as necessity. Children are reminded not to linger in the opening every second it gapes. Is a second, the family shivers. The doorway becomes a constant test of discipline. Shut it, secure it. Respect the heat your kin worked to build. There's a sensory layer to it too. Each time the flap lifts, a swirl of scents trades places. Outside air sweeps in crisp and metallic, full of snow and pine. Inside air rushes out, heavy with smoke, stew and fur. For a heartbeat the two worlds collide, and then the flap falls shut, restoring the fragile separation. You notice how sharply your skin reacts, goosebumps at the icy kiss, then a thawing warmth once the barrier closes again. Dogs often curl beside the entrance, half guard and half draft stopper. Their bodies plug gaps, and their ears alert sleepers to anyone arriving late. The flap brushes their fur when it swings, and they grunt, annoyed before settling again. Even the animals seem to understand. That door is a weak spot, a place that must be watched. Maintenance, of course, never ends. The flap stiffens with ice, tears in storms, or frays with constant handling. Families patch it with new hides, layer mats over the weak spots, or hang heavier pelts in midwinter. Some accounts recall moose hides being prized for this duty, thick enough to block even the bitterest wind. Imagine tugging aside a curtain of moose, hide dense, musky, almost a wall in itself, then feeling the shock of the blizzard as you slip past. And here's a curious side note. Entrances weren't always at the ends of the structure. While many reconstructions place them at both ends of the longhouse, some evidence suggests side doors, especially in emergency situations. These could act as quick exits if fire broke out, a real hazard with all that smoke and tinder. Scholars continue to debate whether side doors were common or rare, but the possibility lingers like a half-seen seam in the archaeological record. As you sit near the doorway, you sense the house's fragility most acutely. All the moss-stuffed seams, all the raised bunks, all the blankets of hide. None of it matters if the flap is left open too long. Warmth, after all, is not permanent. It must be defended constantly. One draft, one crack, one careless child at a time. You lean back, watching how the flap moves with the storm outside. It sways slightly, never quite still, like the lungs of the longhouse itself. Open, close, breathe in, breathe out. And in that rhythm, you see the genius. A simple piece of fur or mat transformed into a hinge between two worlds. Icy death beyond and smoky survival within. The wind claws at the flap, but it holds. And so do you, pressing closer to the firelight, comforted by the thought that this flimsy-looking curtain is, in fact, one of the strongest shields you'll ever know. The hours creep forward, and your gaze drifts upward toward the roof line. The smoke holes, those small, crucial vents, become the silent arbiters of life inside this wooden belly. They are openings cut between overlapping slabs of bark, adjusted with poles from below, sometimes widened, sometimes narrowed, depending on the night. You might expect them to be tidy chimneys. They're not. They're fickle, shifting mouths that both protect and betray the people beneath them. Historical descriptions are clear on one thing. Without smoke holes, longhouses would have been unlivable. Fires smouldered all day and night, and the air had to escape somewhere. At least 2 vents lined up with each hearth, a kind of primitive exhaust system. But unlike chimneys, they weren't sealed channels. They were simple gaps that had to be fussed over constantly. If the wind pressed from the wrong direction, smoke poured downward. If snow clogged the opening, families coughed through the night until someone climbed up to scrape it clear. An amusing oddity surfaces in some accounts. Children were sometimes tasked with vent duty. Imagine a sleepy 12-year-old prodded awake to poke at the bark flaps above, trying to coax the smoke outward while keeping snow from cascading in. One early European visitor joked that every longhouse was a school of smoke management where children learned quickly or suffered the sting in their eyes. You can almost hear a groggy voice muttering, "Just 5 more minutes," while smoke thickens like a wool blanket over the bunks. But scholars don't all agree on how well these vents worked. Some argue the draft effect was surprisingly efficient, pulling air through the center aisle like a chimney system. Others contend the interior was perpetually hazy, with visibility shrinking the higher you looked. Reconstructions built in modern times have produced both results. In some, the roof clears smoke beautifully. In others, the ceiling turns into a cloud chamber. Which version was most typical remains unsettled, leaving us to imagine a spectrum of experiences, from breathable warmth to choking haze. Sitting here, you feel the evidence firsthand. Smoke drifts in slow ribbons toward the roof, eddying like ghosts against the bark. Some escapes into the night, but much lingers, tinting the air with a permanent dusk. Your eyes water slightly, your throat prickles, and yet you also notice how strangely protective the smoke island, insects that might otherwise thrive in this crowded space, are subdued. Meat and fish hung from rafters above your head dry steadily, the smoke warding off rot. Even hides stay more supple in the constant haze. The discomfort has its benefits, and everyone here has learned to live with stinging eyes for the sake of safety. The smell, of course, clings to everything. Clothes, hair, even the walls themselves soak in the smoke until the longhouse becomes an olfactory identity. Outsiders would notice it instantly. That acrid perfume of hearth smoke and bark oil, impossible to wash away. It's the scent of belonging. When you step outside in the morning, the air feels too clean, almost alien, and you long for the smoky womb again. The sounds of the vents are another sensory layer. In heavy wind, they whistle faintly, a high note above the chorus of crackling fires. When snow slips through, it patters on hides or mats below, cold droplets hissing as they strike hot embers. These tiny intrusions remind you the roof is not a solid wall, it is a living membrane, breathing with the storm. Sometimes people deliberately manipulated the vents to balance heat and air, push them wide, and smoke flows out, but warmth follows. Close them tight, and the room swelters with choking haze but traps precious heat. Families argued, no doubt, about which was worse, smoke in your lungs or frost in your bones. Perhaps the decision shifted night to night, or even hour to hour, depending on wind and fire. Imagine lying there, voices rising in the dimness. Open it wider. No, you'll freeze us. Then stop feeding the fire so much. The vent becomes less a chimney than a mediator of household quarrels. One striking observation from archaeologists: the rafters of excavated longhouse sites often carry thick layers of soot. Charred residue clings to the wood, proof that smoke lingered year after year. In some sites, these soot layers measure inches thick, like black rings of time. Each winter added another coat, darkening the timbers until the very bones of the house became smoke themselves. You imagine looking up now, seeing rafters stained as though they had been dipped in ink, holding decades of fire in their fibers. There's also the symbolic role. Among some nations, smoke rising through those holes was thought to carry prayers skyward. The vent wasn't only a necessity but a channel, linking earth to spirit. Breath, fire, story, all of it drifted upward, meeting the stars through that tiny gap. It's humbling to think, what you experience as coughs and watery eyes was, for others, a sacred connection. So you lie back, watching smoke coil toward the stars, wondering how many lifetimes passed under these same plumes. The vent lets in snow, leaks warmth, and irritates lungs. Yet it also lets the people inside endure. It is imperfection turned into survival. The storm outside groans, snow hammers the roof, and still the smoke finds its way out. You breathe shallowly, half in discomfort, half in gratitude. The vent may not be perfect, but it is enough. You stretch your legs under the hides, and something brushes against your feet, soft, warm, and startlingly alive. You jolt for a moment, before realizing it's a dog curling itself into the crook of your ankles. The longhouse isn't just filled with humans. It has other sleepers too. Dogs lived here as much as the families did, padding between bunks, wagging their tails near the fires, and then settling in the best place of all, pressed right against your body. One thing that emerges again and again in early descriptions is how indispensable these animals were, not only as hunting companions and guards, but as heat sources. In crowded winter nights, every scrap of warmth mattered. A dog nestled against your legs became an extra layer of insulation, a breathing, fur-covered ember. If you've ever camped with a dog in a tent, you know exactly how effective that warmth can be. The people of the Longhouse knew it too, and they welcomed the animals right into their sleeping arrangements. There's an amusing glimpse from travelers who noted dogs sometimes stole prime spots near the fire. They'd sprawl so close their fur singed, forcing children to nudge them back with sticks. Yet no one truly banished them. They were too valuable, too woven into the household's rhythm. Their barking warned of threats, their presence deterred pests, and their heat was a nightly gift. You can picture someone grumbling, "That dog takes more room than I do," even as they pull the animal closer when the wind howls outside. Researchers continue to discuss how central dogs were in daily longhouse life. Some argue they were primarily working animals, let inside only occasionally. Others point to archaeological finds of dog burials and suggest they were kin in their own right, fully integrated into family routines. The exact balance between pet, tool, and fellow sleeper is debated, but tonight you feel the answer pressed warmly against your toes. The sensory details are undeniable. The dog's fur is coarse on top, softer beneath, faintly oily with the smell of the outdoors. Each exhale carries a puff of animal breath, musky but oddly comforting. The weight of its body pins your feet in place, grounding you with a reminder that survival here is never solitary. Even the animals play their part in the nightly battle against cold. Sometimes, stories say, dogs curled not just at feet but across entire bodies. A child might sleep half buried beneath 2 or 3 dogs, wrapped in both fur hide and fur flesh. You imagine the muffled giggles of children as warm paws kneaded their blankets, followed by the sigh of surrender as everyone drifted back to sleep. The line between pet and blanket blurred completely. Of course, there were drawbacks. Fleas and lice travelled as easily on dogs as on humans, and the crowded environment amplified the problem. Some families countered this with herbal washes or smoke baths, holding animals over smouldering herbs to cleanse their coats. The image might make you chuckle, a squirming dog enduring a smoky spa treatment in the middle of a winter night, but it reflects a constant truth. Even your furry heaters needed maintenance. There's also a deeper symbolic thread. Among several native nations, dogs carried spiritual roles as guardians of the afterlife or as intermediaries in ritual. To sleep with a dog was not only practical but spiritually resonant. Its presence shielded you from more than frost. It kept away darker, less tangible threats. When a child snuggled against a dog, the protection was twofold: warmth and ward. The longhouse atmosphere shifts subtly because of them. Their occasional growl or whine interrupts the rhythm of human breathing, reminding you that this house shelters more than people. Their paws scratch faintly at wood, their tails thump in dreams, and their ears prick at sounds outside. You are never truly unguarded with dogs at your feet. Think of the contrast. Outside, wolves prowl in the snow, their howls piercing the night. Inside, their smaller cousins lie at your side, loyal, tamed, transformed into allies. The wilderness presses against the walls, but here in this smoky cocoon, its sharpest teeth are dulled by fur, warmth, and companionship. You shift slightly, and the dog sighs, curling tighter. Its body radiates steady heat, better than any stone warmed by the fire. For a fleeting moment, you feel a kinship beyond words. Survival isn't just human determination, it's interspecies cooperation, a pact of warmth. The storm still rattles the bark outside, but under hides and fur, with a dog curled across your feet, you feel something more than safety. You feel continuity. Humans and animals sharing the same fire, the same smoke, the same dream of lasting through the night. And in that realization, your body relaxes again, soothed not only by the heat but by the heartbeat thudding gently against your toes. The storm outside refuses to rest. Wind claws at the bark walls, and snow hisses as it slides down the roof, rattling poles and tugging at seams. Inside you feel the drafts snake across your cheek, thin as ghostly fingers. Everyone stirs. No one can ignore when winter muscles its way in. It's time for repairs, those constant, urgent adjustments that keep the longhouse alive when midwinter tries its best to tear it apart. Archaeologists point out one steady truth. Longhouses weren't static. They were in a state of near constant upkeep. Bark panels loosened in storms, reeds slumped, mats wore thin. Families were always patching, stuffing, reinforcing. The work didn't pause because the season was harsh, it intensified precisely because it was harsh. You picture someone shaking off the furs, grabbing a bundle of cattail stalks, and wedging them into a seam that had started to whistle with cold. Survival wasn't just a nightly ritual, it was a continuous construction project. And here's a vivid little aside. Some reports describe entire families climbing onto the roof during winter lulls, stomping snow into place deliberately. Rather than clearing it, they packed it down like extra insulation. The roof became a layered cake of bark, poles, and compressed snow, heavy but surprisingly effective at keeping in warmth. You can almost hear the laughter of children sent up to stamp their feet, turning a dangerous blizzard into an impromptu game. "Don't fall through," someone yells, and the children stomp harder, leaving the longhouse snugger than before. Experts, however, still debate how often such dramatic repairs happened during deep winter. Some argue that most patching was done before the snow set in, with families retreating into a kind of hibernation once storms began. Others insist that maintenance was constant, even in January, with people braving ladders and rooftops when the alternative was freezing inside. Archaeological reconstructions give both impressions. Some look sturdier than others, so the question lingers unresolved. You press your palm against the wall now and feel where fresh moss has been crammed in just hours ago. It's still damp from the marsh where it was gathered, smelling faintly green beneath the blanket of smoke. Another seam nearby shows evidence of a quick fix mud smeared along the gap, hardened into a brittle crust. Whoever patched it must have rushed, yet even that rough job makes a difference. The draft softens, the air steadies, and you feel gratitude for hands that worked while you slept. The longhouse interior buzzes with quiet labor. A man shifts a bark slab into place, wedging it against a post. A woman knots a new mat from reeds, her fingers swift despite the cold. Children carry bundles of dried moss, stuffing them where instructed. The tasks aren't glamorous, but they are life. And each sound, the creak of poles, the soft tearing of moss, the snap of bark splitting, reminds you that the building itself is not a passive shelter. It's a living project, constantly adjusted, always demanding. There's a strange comfort in that work. Repairs bring people together, turn anxiety into action. Instead of lying awake fretting about the storm, you share the labor of keeping it out. And in doing so, you also share resilience. Everyone participates. Elders point, children fetch, adults climb or hammer. The longhouse is less a house and more a team effort with walls. Sometimes those efforts went further than patching. Oral accounts mention winter nights when families dragged entire poles inside to brace sagging walls. Picture waking to the groan of timbers, then watching as a group heaves a fresh pole against the structure, wedging it like a splint on a broken bone. The house itself limps through the season with makeshift supports, a testament to ingenuity. A curious quirk shows up in some traditions. People believed certain repairs carried symbolic weight. Hanging a new hide over a gap wasn't just practical. It might also invite the animal's spirit to shield the family. mud daubed in cracks, was sometimes blessed with words or gestures, turning it into more than clay. Whether or not you believe in such rituals, you can sense how much they mattered, how the physical act of fixing also patched emotional and spiritual seams. And of course, there's the endless juggling of firewood. Repairs don't matter if flames sputter out. Wood piles shrink faster than you'd like, and every storm makes gathering more difficult. Families often stored logs inside the longhouse itself, stacked neatly along walls, so that in moments like this, you don't have to face the howling dark outside. You roll over and spot the pile, barkless logs, neatly cut, waiting to be fed to the flames. Their presence is reassurance, like money in a bank account. The smell of repairs lingers, too sharp resin from fresh bark, earthy dampness from moss, metallic tang from wet mud. All these scents mix with smoke and fur, forming an aroma of resilience. You inhale deeply and realize this is what endurance smells like. A building patched by countless hands, layer upon layer of effort, holding back the storm. Yet, despite all the effort, you can still hear the wind pry at the edges, still feel the faint drafts that slip through. The house isn't sealed like a modern cabin. It's a negotiation, a truce struck nightly between wood and weather. And maybe that's why sleep here feels different. You're never entirely shielded, never entirely safe, but you're never helpless either. You're cocooned in the combined will of your family, your clan, your community, who choose to repair again and again rather than surrender. The storm rages on, but inside, with bark patched, moss stuffed, and fires stoked, you feel the longhouse steady itself like a ship riding a wave. It may creak, it may leak, but it holds. And so do you, drifting back beneath your hides, trusting in the endless work of repair that carries everyone through another night. The storm has eased to a dull hush, but inside the longhouse, another rhythm takes over. The quiet clatter of bowls, the fragrant steam of simmering food, the low hum of conversation. You open your eyes and realize that warmth here isn't just bark walls, moss seams, or fur hides. It's also what bubbles in the pots strung above the fire, the communal meals that double as heaters in the deepest part of the night. Accounts from missionaries and early travelers highlight one point again and again. Food and fire were inseparable. The same hearths that dried hides and warmed bodies were the kitchens of the longhouse. Stews of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters of agriculture, were common. Toss in venison, smoked fish, or wild fowl, and you had a dish that not only filled bellies but also sent waves of steam rolling into the cold air. That rising vapor softened the bite of winter, turned the smoky chamber into a fragrant sauna. There's a delightful little detail tucked into some oral traditions. Children often dozed off with bowls still in their hands, warm broth slipping onto hides as they slumped against their elders. No one scolded them. The food wasn't just nourishment, it was lullaby fuel. Imagine drifting to sleep with the smell of corn soup in your nose, a full stomach pressing pleasantly, and the extra humidity making the air less brittle. It might not rival your central heating, but for survival it was genius. Yet, scholars interpret the role of food differently. Some argue that the heat contribution from cooking was minimal compared to the fires themselves. After all, once the pot cooled, so did the steam. Others suggest that with dozens of pots simmering in longhouses housing 50 or more people, the cumulative effect could be substantial, raising the temperature by several degrees. It's one of those points still unresolved, leaving us to imagine the sensory reality, bowls steaming, bodies warming, arguments settling over a shared ladle. You picture the nightly scene. Pots hang from crossbeams, their contents bubbling, the hiss of boiling broth mingling with the crackle of fire. Wooden ladles clink against clay or bark bowls. Someone coughs, someone laughs, someone slurps loudly enough to earn a playful shove. It is warmth you can taste as much as feel. The smell is intoxicating. Sweet corn mingles with smoky venison, beans release their earthy aroma, squash adds its mellow undertone. For a moment, your senses trick you into believing the longhouse is warmer than it really island. The heat from the food, and the emotional comfort of eating together combine until your body relaxes despite the drafts sneaking in through seams. Sharing food is also sharing heat indirectly. A full belly burns like a furnace. Calories convert into warmth, and your body becomes a better radiator for those pressed beside you on the bunks. That's why meals matter not just socially, but thermally. A hungry sleeper is a cold sleeper. A well-fed one is a warming presence in the communal quilt. Here's a quirky aside. Some stories mention that families deliberately cooked at odd hours late in the night, not just during the day. Why? Because the act of cooking itself reinvigorated the house. Fires blazed higher, pots steamed, movement stirred everyone, and the longhouse briefly shook off its icy lethargy. Midnight stew wasn't just indulgence, it was strategy. It wasn't all comfort, of course. Food scraps attracted pests, and in a crowded longhouse, mice and insects were constant intruders. Dogs snapped at them, children giggled at the chase, but elders knew it was a serious battle. Smoke helped deter the worst of it, but vigilance was constant. You can picture someone muttering in frustration as a mouse darts away with a stolen kernel, warmth and resources both at risk. Food also wove social glue. Each hearth might belong to two families, but meals often crossed boundaries. You might find yourself eating from your aunt's pot one night, or trading venison for beans with neighbors down the aisle. That sharing built more than nutrition, it built obligation, gratitude, gossip, and in a house where people slept elbow to elbow, those ties mattered as much as any wall of bark. Debate lingers over how formalized those meal-sharing patterns were. Some anthropologists argue it was casual and ad hoc. Others see evidence of strict etiquette about who ate first, who served, and who had rights to which pot. The reality was likely a spectrum. Different nations, different villages, different seasons shaping different practices. But for you, right now, the sensation is simple. Steam rising, hunger fading, warmth spreading from both inside and out. As you sip the hot broth, your body loosens, shoulders dropping, eyelids growing heavy. Heat flows from your stomach to your skin, meeting the radiance of the fire and the press of hides. You feel doubly shielded, armored in food as much as in fur, and you realize survival here isn't a single strategy, it's a whole web. Bark walls, moss seams, raised bunks, flaps of hide, dog fur, and now bowls of soup all working together to keep a thin-skinned primate alive in a winter that should by all rights kill you. The storm growls faintly outside again, but inside the longhouse, the only growl is your stomach, satisfied now, silenced by stew. You curl tighter beneath the hides, warmed by food, family and fire, and understand why people here endured not just a single night, but whole lifetimes of winters without freezing. The fires crackle steadily now, their glow spilling across faces gathered in a semicircle. Bellies full from stew, people are in no hurry to crawl under their hides. Instead, they linger near the warmth, voices rising and falling in a rhythm that feels as old as the timbers themselves. It isn't just talk, it's ceremony, story, and ritual. Movement joins words, hands gesture, feet stamp gently on the planks. Warmth in the longhouse isn't only physical, it's generated by spirit and motion. One recurring observation from early visitors is that longhouses weren't silent dormitories. After dark, they became theatres of memory. Elders recited origin tales, clan histories, and seasonal lessons. The act of storytelling itself filled the night with energy. You can feel it as you listen now. The cadence of a familiar voice, the children's muffled laughter, the rustle of listeners leaning closer. Even when fires burned low, these gatherings created a second kind of heat, emotional, communal, intangible, but real. A curious little detail comes from oral accounts. Certain dances were performed indoors during winter, even in cramped spaces. Imagine people rising from their bunks, circling the central aisle, stamping their feet in unison while drums thudded softly. The movement wasn't just symbolic, it drove circulation, warded off numb toes, and generated body heat for everyone pressed around the fire. Ritual doubled as exercise, ensuring bodies stayed limber, while the storm outside begged for hibernation. Scholars still discuss how formal these nightly events were. Some suggest ceremonies happened only on special occasions, while others believe storytelling and dance were nearly nightly habits woven into survival routines. Excavated longhouse sites reveal fire pits large enough to accommodate gatherings. Yet whether those flames lit regular performances or occasional feasts is still debated. You sit now, watching the glow on faces, and the answer feels obvious. When winter stretches endless, stories are not luxuries, they are necessities. The sensory landscape of these rituals is vivid. The drumbeat reverberates against bark walls, a steady pulse that masks the moan of wind outside. Voices layer over one another, some rising in song, some murmuring in agreement, some interrupting with laughter. Smoke curls upward, lit by the firelight into swirling ribbons that seem almost alive. Your skin tingles, not from cold, but from the contagious energy of the gathering. Even the smells shift. A pinch of dried sage tossed onto the coals fills the air with sharpness, masking the musk of hides. Someone chews dried berries, sweetening their breath. You inhale, and it feels like the longhouse has transformed not just a survival chamber, but a sacred space. There's another quirky aside here. Some accounts suggest that during long ceremonies, smoke holes were adjusted deliberately to keep the chamber denser with smoke, enhancing the dramatic glow of firelight and perhaps adding to the spiritual effect. Imagine choosing thicker haze not for warmth, but for atmosphere, so that spirits seemed nearer and stories more vivid. The practical and mystical blurred until one fed the other. Children, of course, were at the heart of these gatherings. Tucked between elders, they listened wide-eyed to tales of heroes and tricksters, lessons coded in entertainment. Their laughter rippled like sparks, their questions kept elders sharp, and their very presence guaranteed continuity. Each story ensured that when these children grew, they would tell the same tales under the same rafters, keeping not just the house but the culture warm against winter's chill. And while the community shared myths and rituals, motion itself kept cold at bay. A sudden burst of drumming, a playful chase of children down the aisle, or even the stomping of feet in rhythm, all sent heat coursing through limbs. You shift in your place, stamping lightly, and feel how quickly warmth follows. It isn't modern aerobics, but it works. Historians disagree on just how much ritual life revolved around survival. Some argue it was practical first, spiritual second. Others believe the opposite, that ceremonies created the will to endure, which in turn enabled survival. The line is thin, blurred by memory and interpretation. For you, sitting here wrapped in fur while stories swirl around, the answer doesn't matter. What matters is the way warmth flows not just from fire, but from the bonds of voices joined in the night. The storm outside is still there, clawing at the bark, but inside you hardly notice anymore. The longhouse hums with song, laughter, and dance, and in that living soundscape, you feel the cold retreat. Not defeated, never entirely banished, but held back by the oldest shield humanity has ever wielded, the power of story and shared spirit. You lean your head against the hide behind you, eyelids heavy, lulled by voices, and realize that warmth has many faces. Tonight, it glows in fire, pulses in footsteps, and whispers in tales passed down through generations. And as you drift closer to sleep, the realization settles. Sometimes, the surest way to keep from freezing is to keep the soul burning bright. You shift beneath the heavy hides, and notice how carefully everyone seems positioned. A baby is nestled between its mother and grandmother, the elders' bodies forming a living wall of warmth around the fragile child. A boy about 10 squeezes himself closer to his uncle, while his father stretches out on the other side. In this smoky chamber, the arrangement is no accident, it's a strategy, perfected over generations. Ethnographers often point out that the sleeping order inside longhouses mirrored both practicality and culture. The youngest, who lost body heat fastest, were placed between older relatives. Infants rarely slept alone. They were sandwiched for insulation, the softest hides tucked around them. Elders, though they generated less heat, provided steady, protective bulk. In this way, bodies became layers, stacked like insulation within a wall. To lie where you were told was less about comfort than about survival mathematics. One charming detail emerges from oral traditions. Children were sometimes teased awake if they wriggled free of their protective sandwich. "You want to be a frozen rabbit?" An aunt might scold before tugging them back beneath the furs. The laughter softened the warning, but the meaning was serious. Drifting away from the group in the middle of the night could mean shivering uncontrollably before morning. The mockery kept them close and alive. Scholars still differ when interpreting how rigid these sleeping positions were. Some suggest that households rotated who slept in the middle or on the edges, balancing comfort and responsibility. Others argue that kinship dictated placement. Infants always between parents, elders near the fire, younger men and women fending off drafts at the periphery. Archaeological traces of longhouse bunks don't resolve the matter. All we have are accounts written centuries later. Was the system flexible or strictly enforced? The debate continues, leaving us to imagine multiple nightly choreographies. As you lie there, you feel the heat gradient. The center of the group is warm, almost too warm, while the edge near the drafty seam nips at your skin. Being pressed in the middle is not glamorous, you're smothered, overheated, elbows in your ribs, but it's far preferable to the icy whisper on the outside. You realize that sacrifice rotated through generations, children protected at all costs, elders buffering where they could, stronger bodies absorbing the discomfort for the group's sake. The sensory experience of this arrangement is intense. A child's small hand presses against your chest, damp with sleep sweat. An elder's breath rasps steadily behind your ear. Every inch of space is filled with contact knees, arms, shoulders overlapping, until you feel less like an individual and more like part of one large, many-limbed organism. Privacy evaporates. Warmth replaces it. A curious aside, some accounts mention charms or amulets tied above children's bunks. Small pouches of herbs, feathers, or carved figures dangled near where they slept, thought to shield them from bad dreams or illness. Practical or not, the presence of these little bundles reassured parents. Combined with the protective wall of family bodies, the child was encased in both physical and spiritual insulation. Of course, this closeness sometimes sparked conflict. Snoring was a nightly villain. Someone's uncle rumbled like thunder, and cousins elbowed him awake. Babies cried, toddlers kicked, dogs barked. But even amid the noise, the placement persisted. Complaints didn't alter the system, because everyone knew the arrangement saved lives. Better to endure irritation than risk losing a child to cold. What fascinates anthropologists is how this nightly practice shaped cultural identity. The physical act of pressing together reinforced the emotional lesson. You survive as a community, not as individuals. The youngest were cared for by the oldest. The strong endured for the weak, and everyone shared the consequence. Sleeping order became a living metaphor for the clan itself. Interdependent, layered, protective. You roll slightly, feeling how your body fits into this pattern. Your hip meets another's thigh. Your arm brushes a child's hair. Your back presses against a grandmother's shoulder. You are both protected and protector, both shield and shielded. The system makes no distinction between warmth and duty. They are the same thing here. The storm outside rattles the walls again, and a fresh draft slips through a seam. The baby stirs, whimpering, and instantly the grandmother tightens her hold, pulling hides tighter, pressing her chest forward. The group shifts unconsciously, sealing gaps, readjusting, relayering the living quilt. It's an instinct as natural as breathing. No one thinks, "I must protect the baby." They simply do, because that is the rhythm of longhouse life. And in that rhythm, you begin to understand something profound. Survival isn't only about fires, hides, or moss. It's about bodies arranged with intention, love expressed through warmth, generations physically interwoven through the night. You close your eyes, press tight, and realize that here, against the winter, family itself is the blanket. You blink awake to the faint glow of embers and notice the rafters overhead. They loom like a wooden lattice above the smoke, crisscrossed beams straining under the weight of time and soot. And dangling from those beams, you see the silhouettes of tools, baskets, and even weapons objects suspended above the bunks like strange ornaments in the smoky gloom. At first glance it seems cluttered, but soon you realize there's cleverness here. The rafters aren't just structural, they're storage, insulation, and sometimes even radiators of warmth. Archaeologists often point out that longhouses doubled as warehouses. Tools of daily life, bows, fishing gear, baskets of dried corn were hung from the rafters where smoke preserved them. Keeping things off the ground protected them from pests, kept them dry, and freed up space for sleeping platforms. Every inch of the interior carried a purpose, from the lowest plank to the highest beam. Here's a curious little aside. Some families even dangled snowshoes overhead, where the constant smoke cured and hardened the sinew lacing. By the time spring thawed the world outside, those shoes were ready to hit the slush, already tempered by months of indoor haze. You can almost picture someone tugging down a pair, brushing soot off the frame, and slipping them on as if smoke were simply another tool in the workshop. There's still disagreement among historians about how much warmth these suspended items contributed. Some argue that baskets and bundles created an insulating ceiling, slowing the escape of heat. Others dismiss that idea, suggesting the effect was negligible compared to the fire itself. But if you sit where you are now, you feel it. Warmth rising, caught by objects overhead, radiating faintly downward like a primitive attic blanket. The rafters hold not only tools but also a thin, invisible layer of trapped heat. The sensory experience is rich. You catch the dry rattle of corn kernels shifting in a basket when someone bumps a support pole. You hear the hollow clunk of a wooden club swinging gently in the draft. Above your head, pelts flutter slightly, releasing the smell of fur and smoke. The ceiling becomes a whispering chorus of objects, each one telling its own story of survival. Some of those stories are spiritual. Oral traditions describe charms and sacred items suspended near rafters, protecting the household from misfortune. A carved figure, a bundle of feathers, a pouch of herbs, they weren't just storage, they were guardians. To lie beneath them was to sleep under the watch of spirits, as though the longhouse itself had hung its own constellation of protectors above your dreams. And then there's the practical reality. By hanging gear overhead, you kept it warm enough to handle. Imagine grabbing a spear left outside overnight, it would freeze your skin instantly. But up here, above the fires, wood stayed dry, sinew flexible, leather pliable. Tools were always ready, not brittle with cold. It was a small but essential difference, one that might mean life or death when hunting or defending the village. A quirky detail. In some accounts, smoked fish and meat dangled so low that children were scolded for sneaking bites in the night. The temptation must have been overwhelming, salty, oily aromas drifting down as you lay hungry on your bunk. Some elders even joked that the hardest part of surviving winter wasn't the cold, but keeping children from raiding the pantry hanging just inches above their noses. The rafters, however, weren't without risk. Sparks sometimes leapt upward, threatening to ignite stored hides or baskets. Families had to be careful, adjusting fire size and watching for embers. Stories circulate of disastrous blazes, whole longhouses consumed because one spark found its way into the wrong bundle. That danger was always present, a reminder that warmth and destruction were uneasy neighbors. Still, the rafters defined the atmosphere. You glance upward again, noting how the beams disappear into shadow, soot blackening everything into one long, smoky tapestry. It feels like lying beneath a forest, turned upside-down branches heavy with fruit. Except here the fruit is your livelihood, dangling quietly above you. Some researchers believe that this overhead storage added not just warmth but a sense of psychological comfort. To look up and see food, tools, and weapons above you was to feel secure, even in the dead of winter. Hunger and danger pressed at the walls, but reassurance dangled from the rafters. You slept not beneath emptiness but beneath abundance, a ceiling that whispered, "You have enough." The soundscape deepens as people stir. Someone reaches up, pulling down a basket, its wicker creaking. Another shifts a bough to one side. These little movements join the fire's crackle and the wind's moan outside, creating a layered music of survival. Nothing is wasted space here. The house itself is a three-dimensional puzzle, every layer filled, every corner pressed into service. You settle back, closing your eyes, comforted by the sense of storage hanging over you. Tools, charms, food, weapons all suspended in the smoky rafters, all keeping you warm in ways both direct and indirect. You realize then that the Longhouse isn't just a shelter, it's a living organism, with bones, skin, and now a ceiling that breathes with memory and provision. The fire spits softly, and a faint drip lands on your shoulder. At first you think it's snow sneaking through the smoke hole, but when you brush it away, your fingers come back damp, not cold. You tilt your head and realize the truth. Condensation. The Longhouse, for all its brilliance, has a relentless enemy: moisture. One thing archaeologists repeatedly highlight is that moisture management was a constant challenge. With dozens of people breathing, cooking, and sweating inside a bark and moss structure, humidity built quickly. Warm air from fires hit the cold bark roof, and water condensed. Drips fell in the night, sometimes harmless, sometimes soaking hides or mats until they reeked of mildew. The battle wasn't only against cold but against dampness, which could steal warmth as cruelly as any draft. There's a peculiar observation from a 17th century missionary. He complained that his bedding in a longhouse grew so damp that he woke colder than if he had slept outside under the stars. He didn't mean the fire failed. He meant that wetness seeped into every layer until warmth fled his body anyway. You can picture him muttering curses while wringing out his cloak, surrounded by families who had long since learned tricks to mitigate the problem. What were those tricks? Some families laid extra mats beneath hides, layering reeds that absorbed drips before they reached skin. Others angled bark panels to funnel moisture towards the walls. Children might be tasked with flipping damp bedding toward the fire to dry. A nightly game of rotation. The longhouse smelled perpetually of steaming hides and mats because something was always being dried out. Scholars diverge on how severe the moisture problem was. Some argue it was a minor inconvenience, exaggerated by outsiders unused to communal living. Others insist it was a daily frustration, forcing constant vigilance and contributing to coughs and lung troubles. The truth is likely somewhere in between, enough to annoy, sometimes enough to endanger, never enough to prevent survival. The sensory details make the problem vivid. You hear the faint patter of drops hitting mats, almost like rain inside the house. You smell the sour tang of damp bark mixed with smoke. You feel the clammy chill when a blanket that was warm an hour ago turns cold with absorbed moisture. And yet, alongside irritation, you also notice the resilience it forged. People adapted, shifted, invented small fixes that added up. A quirky aside comes from oral histories that mention ashes spread beneath bunks. Not only did ash insulate against drafts, but it also absorbed dampness. A dry powder beneath your sleeping platform could catch leaks, keeping moisture from pooling. Imagine lying above a layer of yesterday's fire, protected by the same ash that once burned as wood. Recycling at its most practical. Dogs, too, played their part. Their constant shifting and shaking helped redistribute dampness. When a wet flat brushed them at the entrance, they'd shake off sprays of water, sending droplets into the smoky air. Annoying, yes, but it cleared fur before they leapt onto bunks, keeping blankets from soaking worse. You sigh as one such spray dots your face, realizing even nuisances carry hidden benefits. Moisture had a subtler danger as well. Mold, longhouse walls, stuffed with reeds and moss, could harbour growth when perpetually damp. Some accounts describe strong earthy odours, likely mould spores lingering in the seams. Whether this caused illness or was just tolerated is debated. Some scholars suggest higher rates of lung issues in these households. Others dismiss the evidence as anecdotal. The argument remains unresolved, lingering like the smell of mildew itself. Still, nightly life pressed on. The act of drying became part of the routine. Families draped damp hides near embers, turned mats, rearranged bedding. The glow of fire wasn't just for warmth. It was a drying rack. The air shimmered with steam as moisture lifted away, only to return with the next round of breathing, cooking, and snow seepage. Survival was a rhythm of damp and dry, never permanent, always in flux. There's even humour in the struggle. One oral account recalls children teasing each other by catching drips in their mouths, pretending it was roof rain. Adults scolded them, but you can imagine the laughter cutting through the gloom. Even hardship became a game when reframed through young eyes. As you shift under your hides, a fresh drip falls on your wrist. You wipe it away and tuck the hide tighter. It's not comfortable, not ideal, but it's endurable. That's the theme of the longhouse in winter, not perfection, but persistence. Warmth never came unchallenged. Every advantage carried its own drawback. Smoke that warmed but choked, hides that insulated but stank, walls that protected but dripped. And yet, here you are, damp, smoky, crowded but alive. The fire glows, the hides hold, the family snores around you. Moisture may gnaw at the edges of comfort, but it doesn't claim the center. You close your eyes again, listening to the drip-drip like a lullaby, proof that even imperfection can be survived, night after night, winter after winter. The drip of condensation fades as the fire is fed again, and your eyes catch the pile stacked carefully against the inner wall. A mountain of logs, some split, some whole, some already half charred, sits ready within reach of the hearth. It looks almost like a second wall, a barricade of wood. You realize this pile is as crucial as the hides over your body or the moss in the seams. Without it, the longhouse would go dark, and everyone inside would shiver themselves toward despair. Historians are nearly unanimous on this point. Firewood was currency. Families spent enormous effort stockpiling it before snow sealed the forest. In autumn, groups ventured out to cut, haul, and stack cords of wood, knowing each stick would later mean another hour of warmth. Villages competed with time itself, racing to gather enough fuel before storms made travel impossible. When you glance at the neat rows indoors now, you're seeing the result of months of labor compressed into one glowing pile. A curious little detail surfaces in oral accounts. Children were sometimes given the chore of feeding the fire, not as punishment but as a badge of responsibility. Imagine a child creeping up in the night, guided by the dull glow, sliding one log carefully into the embers, then scampering back to their bunk. That small act, repeated countless times, carried a family through. Parents trusted children to hold the line against the cold, one stick at a time. Experts debate whether the wood supply was always sufficient. Some argue that communities planned so carefully they rarely ran short. Others insist shortages were common, forcing families to burn bark, roots, or even dismantled structures. Archaeological evidence of ash layers mixed with odd materials, splintered poles, charred reed mats suggests that desperation fires did occur. You can almost hear the groan of someone breaking apart an old basket, muttering, "Better fuel than furniture." The sensory landscape of the woodpile is vivid. You smell the resin of pine, sharp even under layers of smoke. The logs creak as they dry, popping faintly in the heat. Your hand brushes their rough surfaces, splinters prickling your skin. The pile radiates reassurance simply by existing like a bank account you can draw warmth from at will. A quirky aside, wood wasn't just stacked indoors. Some longhouses stored logs beneath the raised sleeping platforms, hidden from sight but close enough to reach without venturing outside. Imagine leaning over the edge of your bunk, fishing out a log, and tossing it toward the fire without leaving your blanket. Lazy? Maybe. Practical? Absolutely. And yet, the labor never ended. Every few days, someone still braved the outdoors to fetch more. You picture a figure wrapped in furs, crunching through waist-high snow, dragging a sled of logs back to the door. Their breath fogs the night air, their arms ache, and frost clings to their eyebrows. They stomp back inside, shaking snow onto the mats, only to hear someone call, "More wood tomorrow." It's thankless, endless, but utterly necessary. One ethnographer noted that firewood was so central to survival that disputes sometimes arose over who had rights to which pile within a communal longhouse. Did one family contribute more? Did another take too much? Sharing warmth could be as politically fraught as sharing food. Scholars still disagree on how those conflicts were resolved through strict rules, casual generosity, or tense negotiation. The answer is likely all three, depending on the village and the season. You glance at the fire now, and feel the rhythm of dependence. The embers glow red, logs crackle, sparks leap upward. Then the glow dims, the warmth falters, and someone stirs to add another log. The fire surges back, shadows dance again, and the cycle continues. Warmth is never permanent. It must be constantly fed. The sound is its own comfort. Logs fall with a soft thud, splinters hiss as they ignite, coals sigh as fresh fuel settles in. You listen to this wood-fed heartbeat, knowing that without it, silence would creep in the terrible silence of cold seeping into every bone. There's something symbolic, too, about this indoor forest. The logs stacked around you are the trees of summer, cut down and carried in, now burning slowly to hold life through winter. The forest lives on inside the house, transformed into heat and light. It's a reminder of the deep bond between people and land, of how survival depends on an endless dialogue with the world outside. And so you settle deeper into your furs, watching as another log is laid onto the fire. Sparks leap, shadows flicker, warmth swells again. The woodpile shrinks by one, but the longhouse breathes easier. It's a trade, simple but profound. The tree gives itself, the fire receives it, and you live to see another dawn. The fresh log catches, embers flaring, and you notice how your breath turns visible in the faint candle-like glow. Each exhale rises as a ghostly plume, joining the smoke already hovering above. Dozens of other breaths mingle with yours, creating a haze that thickens the air into something almost tangible. In the middle of the night, it's as though you're lying inside a cloud spun from fire, lungs, and memory. Early observers of longhouse life remarked often on this sight. The vapor of human breath drifting in the cold air, illuminated by firelight. It was both eerie and reassuring. Eerie, because it reminded you of how thin the line was between life and death, your warmth escaping visibly, proof of how quickly it could be lost. Reassuring, because the sight of so many breath clouds meant you weren't alone. You were surrounded by others fighting the same battle, alive together in the darkness. A curious little observation comes from oral stories describing children making games out of this breath. They puffed exaggerated clouds, trying to outdo one another, or held their mouths to the firelight to see whose mist shone brightest. Laughter carried through the smoke, softening the harshness of the night. In the simplest way, play turned vulnerability into joy. Scholars, however, disagree on how much of this breath really changed the climate inside. Some argue that dozens of lungs added significant humidity and warmth, raising the temperature by several degrees. Others suggest the effect was marginal, noting that without constant fire, body heat alone couldn't sustain comfort. The debate lingers, but if you're lying here, you feel the truth in your bones. The warmth around you doesn't just come from flames. It comes from every inhale and exhale pooling together like an invisible quilt. The sensory details are unmistakable. Your breath tastes of smoke, tinged with corn soup from earlier. Your skin feels clammy where vapor condenses, slick for a moment before it evaporates. You hear the soft hiss of lungs in unison, a soundless choir exhaling into the rafters. Every sense reminds you that air itself is part of the survival strategy, recycled endlessly, thickened with the evidence of life. There's an odd practicality here too. The mingling of breath and smoke made the air dense enough to ward off some pests. Fleas, gnats, and even mice disliked the heavy atmosphere, retreating to cracks and corners. What was stifling to you was deterrent to them. One person's discomfort became the household's protection. A quirky note appears in Jesuit records. Some Europeans complained that the smoky breath-laden air left them dizzy, while their native hosts seemed unfazed. Adaptation had turned what might suffocate a visitor into a tolerable norm for the residents. Your lungs sting, yes, but you also realize you can endure it. Maybe not with grace, maybe with a cough or two, but enough to rest and wake again. The flicker of firelight turns each exhale into a momentary apparition. You watch the faces of others half lit, their breath streaming upward like spirit animals rising to the roof. For some nations, smoke and breath together symbolized connection to the unseen world prayers carried skyward on the same current that carried warmth. It was as though every sigh and whisper joined the fire's offering, drifting toward the stars. But practical issues returned again and again. When too many people breathed in one space, oxygen thinned and the air grew heavy. Some longhouses had deliberate vents low near the ground to draw in fresh air, balancing the smoke holes above. Others relied on sheer draft through door flaps. The system wasn't perfect, but the balance oxygen in, smoke out was maintained just enough to avoid disaster. Modern reconstructions still argue about how breathable those nights were. Some visitors describe tolerable haziness. Others stumble out coughing, eyes streaming. Scholars continue to debate whether residents were simply tougher or whether structures were cleverly managed in ways outsiders overlooked. Yet the image of breath remains central. Every exhale is a reminder. You are alive, fragile and bound to those around you. Alone, your breath would vanish into the cold. Together, your breaths gather, filling the house with evidence of persistence. You close your eyes and imagine the longhouse as a giant lung, inhaling snow-frosted air, exhaling smoke and steam. And you, one small set of lungs among many, are part of its rhythm. The night deepens, but you drift more easily now. The sound of breathing becomes your lullaby, the misty air your blanket. Cold prowls just beyond the bark, but inside, the combined force of breath, smoke and fire has built a fragile but enduring sanctuary. You surrender to it, lungs rising and falling with the chorus, and let sleep fold over you once more. You stir again, rubbing your eyes against the haze of smoke, and notice something new hanging over one of the bunks. It isn't a hide or basket. It's a woven wool blanket brightly dyed, patterned with stripes unlike anything produced from reeds or skins. You blink at it, realizing this object comes from far beyond the forest, across seas and ships. This is a trade blanket, introduced by Europeans, slowly weaving its way into the nightly rhythm of longhouse life. Accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries consistently describe these blankets arriving through trade networks. Woolens, brought by Dutch, French or English traders, were exchanged for furs and pelts. For native families, they were both novelty and utility, lighter than bear hides, quicker to dry, and striking in their colours. You imagine the wonder of seeing one for the first time, comparing its softness to deer skin, marvelling at how easily it folded and how tightly it held warmth. There's a curious little detail from journals of early traders. Families sometimes cut the blankets into strips, sewing them into coats or leggings, treating them less as bedding and more as versatile fabric. But eventually the simplest use won out. At night, the wool lay across sleeping bodies, adding a new texture to the nightly quilt. Imagine slipping beneath one now, its fibers scratchy compared to supple hide, but its weight familiar to your modern sensibilities. Historians still disagree on how quickly such trade goods displaced traditional materials. Some argue they became coveted immediately, prized as status symbols, and replaced hides within a generation. Others suggest they remained supplementary, treasured but rare, never fully overtaking the practicality of local furs. Excavations of burial sites show both some individuals wrapped in wool, others still in deerskin. The balance between old and new remains unresolved, a picture blurred by trade's uneven reach. For you, the sensory shift is immediate. Wool smells different. Lanolin, earthy but cleaner than smoke. Soaked hides. It doesn't carry the musk of animals hunted in the forest. Its texture is less oily, more fibrous. Lay it across your chest, and it warms quickly, almost too quickly, holding heat like a sponge. Compared to the creak of stiff hide, it's pliant, folding around your body with little resistance. No wonder some families embraced it. And yet, the hides don't vanish. They still line the bunks, pad the floor, and hang over seams. The wool blanket is layered atop, a newcomer joining the ancient ensemble. You can feel the difference between the two, the sleek heaviness of fur pressing down, the springy resilience of wool on top. Together, they create a hybrid warmth, old and new, clasping each other like uneasy allies. A quirky aside from oral traditions, the colours themselves became symbols. Red stripes signalled vitality, blue represented water, green the forest. Blankets weren't merely bedding, they were canvases of meaning, gifts exchanged in diplomacy, displayed in ceremonies. Imagine children tugging at them not just for warmth, but because the bright hues cut through winter's monotone grey. But along with comfort, trade goods carried complications. Wool absorbs sparks more readily than hides, creating fire hazards. It also moulded when damp, a danger in the moist longhouse air. Families learned to dry them carefully, draping them near the hearth, balancing risk with necessity. And as blankets spread, so too did dependence on outside trade, a shift historians often debate. Did these goods enhance survival, or did they begin to erode traditional self-sufficiency? Scholars argue both sides, leaving us with a story that is part warmth, part warning. Still, lying beneath one now, you can't deny its appeal. The blanket feels oddly familiar, a bridge between your world and theirs. You trace its fibers, noticing soot already clinging, stains blending with stripes. It has been adopted fully into this smoky ecosystem, no longer foreign but transformed by use. The longhouse hums as people adjust their layers. Some curl deeper under hides, others pull wool tighter. The mix of textures becomes a nightly experiment, each family discovering what combination works best. You realize survival here isn't frozen in tradition. It adapts, layer by layer, trade by trade, story by story. The fire crackles, the snow presses, the wind moans. But inside, under hides and wool alike, people breathe steadily. The old and the new coexist, imperfect but effective. You close your eyes and let the blanket's warmth seep into your bones, understanding that survival has always been about weaving together whatever threads are at hand. The wool blanket scratches faintly against your chin as you shift, and for a moment you think of comfort. But comfort here isn't measured in softness, it's measured in whether warmth lasts until dawn. That thought leads your mind downward, toward the fire pits at the center of the aisle. You've been watching them for nights now, noticing a peculiar trick. Even when flames die, the longhouse doesn't grow instantly cold. The secret lies beneath the ashes. Archaeologists have uncovered layers of ash in longhouse sites, thick, stratified beds beneath where fires once burned. These weren't accidents of neglect, they were deliberate. Families learned to rake glowing coals into ash, burying them so they smouldered slowly, releasing heat for hours. The ashes insulated the fire, trapping embers like eggs in a nest, ready to be stirred back into flame come morning. What looks like grey dust is, in truth, a hidden furnace. Here's a quirky observation recorded by an early settler. He marvelled at how quickly his hosts rekindled fire at dawn. No flint, no struggle, just a poke into last night's ash, and embers glowed alive again, hungry for a new log. Imagine waking in the dark, shivering, and knowing that warmth is buried right at your fingertips, waiting. You reach in cautiously, careful not to burn your hand, and stir life back into the house. Scholars continue to debate the efficiency of these ash beds. Some argue they released enough steady heat to noticeably warm the interior through the night. Others think their main value was convenience, saving time and resources by preserving embers rather than starting from scratch each morning. Excavations reveal ash layers so thick they suggest years of use, but how much heat they truly gave off remains contested. What isn't disputed is their role in the daily rhythm. The fire never died, it only slept under its blanket of grey. The sensory dimension is powerful. You can smell the faint, acrid tang of old ash, different from fresh wood smoke, like earth and fire fused. When you brush your fingers near the hearth, the ash feels powdery at the top, then suddenly hot just below, like sand on a beach at midday. That hidden warmth reassures you the house never truly goes dark, even when flames appear gone. A curious detail surfaces in some oral histories. People sometimes used those ashes beyond the hearth. Ashes sprinkled beneath bunks absorbed dampness, a kind of natural desiccant. Others smeared ash on hides as insect repellent or even as a primitive soap when mixed with fat. The hearth produced more than heat, it produced tools, medicine, even cleaning supplies. You realize that each handful of ash was treasure, not waste. Picture the nightly ritual. The fire burns through evening meals and stories. As people settle under hides, someone carefully rakes embers, burying them beneath ash, covering them like children tucked in bed. Hours later, the room glows faintly, warmth lingering though flames are gone. In the morning, someone stirs the mound, and fire leaps up as if it never slept. The rhythm is seamless, almost magical, but built entirely on human observation and patience. Of course, risks accompanied the practice. Too much ash could smother the fire completely, leaving the house cold by morning. Too little, and sparks leapt free, threatening to ignite mats or hides. Balance was everything berry enough to keep it alive, but not so much that it suffocated. Families learned by trial and error, guided by generations who had already paid the price of mistakes. There's even humor in this precarious system. Imagine someone teasing their neighbor. Your ashes are lazy, mine kept burning all night. Pride in ember keeping became a quiet contest. Each family convinced their hearth burned more faithfully than the next. In a world where survival was nightly negotiation, such rivalries softened the edge of fear. As you watch the hearth now, the glow beneath the ash mesmerizes you. It's like a secret heartbeat, steady and unseen, pulsing life into the longhouse, even as everyone sleeps. You understand suddenly why early European visitors found it remarkable, because it was both practical and poetic. To bury fire under ash was to turn destruction into protection, chaos into endurance. The storm outside claws again, rattling bark and flapping the hide door. But inside, warmth lingers, drawn not from roaring flames but from quiet coals hidden beneath grey powder. You settle deeper into your furs, breathing in the earthy smoke, and feel gratitude for this humble invention. Ash, often dismissed as dead, is here the guardian of the night. You close your eyes with that thought, comforted by the idea that while you sleep, the longhouse itself sleeps with you, its heart buried under layers of ash, waiting to breathe fire again when morning calls. You roll onto your side, tugging the hides tighter, and suddenly feel a tiny tickle against your neck. Instinctively you scratch, then scratch again. Of course, warmth doesn't come free. In the crowded closeness of the longhouse, every ember that saves you also saves the smallest of uninvited guests. Fleas, lice, and other pests that thrive in the thick press of people, hides, and dogs. Ethnographers consistently note that infestations were part of daily life. When dozens of bodies huddled together under layers of fur, when dogs nestled against bunks, when mats and hides were reused season after season, pests found paradise. No one escaped completely. Warmth meant survival for humans, but it also meant breeding grounds for creatures eager to nibble at skin. And yet, people weren't helpless. There's an intriguing detail preserved in oral traditions. Smoke itself was medicine. Thick, eye-stinging haze that outsiders hated worked as a fumigator. Families would deliberately close smoke holes for stretches, filling the chamber until insects dropped or fled. Imagine lying low, coughing, eyes watering, and hearing someone mutter, "At least the fleas won't survive the night." Smoke was both torment and cure, leaving behind a bittersweet comfort. Scholars debate just how effective these smoky cleansings were. Some argue the density needed to kill pests would have made breathing unbearable, suggesting they were only partial solutions. Others point to ethnobotanical evidence of herbs added to the fire, cedar, sage, sweetgrass, that produced aromatic smoke with insect-repellent qualities. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere in between. Not perfect eradication, but enough relief to make life tolerable. The sensory experience confirms it. You smell the sharp bite of cedar tossed into the fire, mingling with ordinary wood smoke. You hear the hiss as herbs catch, filling the air with acrid sweetness. Your skin prickles as insects scatter, some crawling away, others subdued. You realize the longhouse is both bed and battlefield, the air itself enlisted as weapon. A quirky little observation. Children sometimes competed to catch lice, pinching them between fingernails and tallying their victories. What horrified outsiders became, for them, just another game in the smoky chamber. Laughter turned irritation into play, normalizing what couldn't be fully avoided. You can imagine a grandmother chuckling at the sight, muttering that her grandchildren were at least learning patience. But pests weren't only annoyances, they carried risk, scratching open skin to infection, and in such close quarters, illness spread easily. That's why smoke and herbs mattered so much, not just comfort, but protection against more serious harm. Families layered furs carefully, aired hides near the fire, and rotated mats to reduce infestations. Every task had dual purpose: drying, warming, and defending against the crawling armies hidden in seams. Scholars remain divided on how much pests truly impacted health. Some argue they were constant but minor irritants, tolerated like background noise. Others suggest they contributed to chronic illness, weakening bodies already stressed by cold and hunger. The archaeological record can't tell us definitively, leaving us to weigh stories of complaint against the undeniable fact that people survived despite the nuisance. The sounds of the night remind you again. A child scratches furiously, then sighs. A dog thumps its leg, shaking fleas loose onto the mats. Someone throws another bundle of herbs on the coals, sending fragrant smoke spiraling upward. The longhouse adjusts, adapts, endures. There's symbolism here, too. Some cultures viewed these pests as reminders of humility, proof that no one was above discomfort. Even chiefs itched, even healers scratched. In a way, fleas were democracy embodied in insect form, indifferent to rank, always reminding you of your place in the shared struggle. As you settle back into your hides, you feel another tickle and brush it away. It's not pleasant, but it's not catastrophic either. Compared to the wolves prowling outside or the frost stiffening the earth, these tiny creatures are manageable, and in their own irritating way, they remind you of resilience. Life teems even in the harshest nights. Where warmth exists, so does motion, breath, and survival, whether human or insect. You exhale, coughing lightly at the herbal smoke, and smile despite yourself. The pests may win small battles, but the longhouse wins the war. With smoke, with laughter, with endless patience, the household keeps the balance. And you, scratching your neck and tugging hides closer, drift back into uneasy but enduring sleep. The smoke curls upward, thin and steady now, and you hear a faint murmur from the far end of the longhouse. Not the ordinary chatter of families or the cough of someone stoking coals, but something softer, measured words repeated low, like waves against the shore. You sit up slightly and realize what you're hearing. Prayers, charms whispered into the night. For the people here, warmth isn't only physical, It is guarded by unseen forces, as carefully tended as the fire itself. Ethnographers who listened to winter accounts note one clear truth: sleep was never left unguarded. Families believed dreams could carry dangers as real as frost. Just as moss blocked drafts in walls, charms and rituals blocked harm from slipping into slumber. Amulets dangled near bunks, herbs smouldered in the coals, and whispered words floated upward like invisible blankets. You realize that the Longhouse was both shelter and shrine. There's a curious detail found in Haudenosaunee oral tradition. Certain clans placed carved figures of owls or dogs above their bunks, protectors believed to chase away harmful spirits during the most vulnerable hours. Imagine lying beneath one now, its soot-blackened eyes watching over you, the carved wood both eerie and comforting in the firelight. To an outsider, it might seem superstition. To those inside, it was as essential as fur and fire. Scholars still discuss how widespread these protective practices were. Some argue they were everyday routines, woven seamlessly into nightly life. Others suggest they were reserved for times of illness, mourning, or special ritual seasons. Archaeological evidence of charms is rare. Most were made of perishable wood, fiber, or feathers, but oral testimony insists they were present. The uncertainty lingers, but the emotional reality does not. People needed more than blankets to face the unknown. The sensory experience draws you in. The smell of burning sage drifts across the chamber, sharp and resinous, masking the musk of hides. A grandmother hums a song in a language old enough to seem part of the smoke itself. A child clutches a small pouch of dried plants, its leather worn smooth by generations of hands. The flicker of firelight turns each object into a talisman, alive with meaning. A quirky aside appears in one Jesuit's journal. He described a family drawing lines of ash across their children's foreheads before bed. The gesture, he thought, was superstition. But modern interpreters suggest it carried symbolic weight ash as fire's blessing, protection against both cold and misfortune. Whether practical or spiritual, the act reveals how intertwined warmth and belief were. Dreams themselves were treated seriously. If someone dreamt of water or snow, the household might interpret it as a warning about cold seeping in. If fire appeared in a dream, it was taken as a reminder to tend the hearth more carefully. Sleep was not passive. It was an active dialogue with forces beyond. You roll onto your side now, half smiling at the thought that even your restless dreams tonight would have been woven into the household's lore. Scholars debate the balance between practical and spiritual in these routines. Did charms genuinely alter nightly warmth, or did they simply soothe minds enough to relax into sleep? Some argue that peace of mind itself was a survival tool. Calmer bodies conserved heat better. Others dismiss such explanations as modern rationalizing, suggesting the people themselves would never have separated practical from spiritual in the first place. The debate continues, unresolved, but lying here you feel the answer is simple. Belief is warmth. Confidence itself is insulation. The Longhouse is quiet now, save for the rhythmic hum of prayers and the occasional crackle of fire. You inhale the fragrant smoke, feel the carved figure's shadow above you, and settle deeper into hides. The storm outside may gnash its teeth, but inside, you are wrapped in layers of more than fur. You are guarded by stories, by charms, by whispered breath carrying promises into the dark. And as your eyelids close again, you realize the truth. Survival in the Longhouse wasn't only about sealing out the cold. It was about sealing in courage, weaving strength and faith into the very fabric of nightly rest. You drift into sleep, held not only by the warmth of bodies and fire, but by the unseen embrace of spirits watching from the rafters. The next time you wake, it's not because of cold or pests or someone shifting in the bunks. It's because the entire Longhouse itself is groaning. The timbers creak like old bones, the bark walls rattle under invisible fists, and a thin shriek whistles through some unseen seam. Winter's storm has not passed, it has only gathered strength, now roaring against the house with relentless fury. One observation that runs through early descriptions of these dwellings is how frightening winter nights could sound from inside. Bark and poles might be strong, but they weren't silent. The wind turned them into instruments, each seam vibrating with its own tone. Add to that the distant crash of ice cracking on rivers, the pop of trees splitting in the forest, and you have a symphony designed to keep nerves raw. Survival wasn't just about keeping warm, it was about keeping calm. Here's a curious little detail noted by travelers. People sometimes compared the sound of a storm against the longhouse to the growl of a living creature. Children were told, half joking, that the house was talking to them, reminding everyone to respect its protection. Imagine lying here, hearing the bark slap against poles, and believing the building itself was growling its disapproval of the wind. Oddly enough, the story turned fear into reassurance. If the house was alive, then it was also fighting for you. Scholars still argue how much protection these structures truly offered. Some describe them as surprisingly sturdy, capable of withstanding blizzards that toppled smaller huts. Others emphasize their vulnerability, pointing to oral accounts of roofs ripped open or walls caving under drifts. Archaeological ruins tell both stories. Some show decades of use, others signs of sudden collapse. The debate continues, leaving you to wonder whether the long groan above you tonight is warning or simply routine. The sensory details are overwhelming. You hear the roof groan, beams straining under snow's weight. You smell bark, fresh split by the cold, sharp as resin. You feel drafts crawl across your skin, the air shifting as the house flexes under pressure. Even the fire reacts, flames waver, sparks swirl, smoke shifts direction as the wind bullies its way through gaps. Every sense reminds you that walls are never absolute barriers. Inside, people react in practiced rhythm. A man rises to press new hides against a seam where the whistle is sharpest. A woman grabs children closer, murmuring steady words that mask her worry. Dogs growl low, unsettled by sounds that mimic predators, yet no one panics. This is not their first storm. The longhouse was built not to be invulnerable, but to bend, creak, and hold just enough. A quirky aside from oral stories, some households deliberately told legends of giants or sky spirits during storms, their booming voices said to be the wind itself. Children, instead of trembling, would giggle at the idea that the noise was storytelling from the heavens. You can almost hear a grandfather chuckling now, weaving a tale about a giant stomping across the roof, his steps shaking the bark. The story reframes terror into something bearable, even entertaining. Still, you feel your heart race as another gust slams the house, rattling tools in the rafters. Snow sprays through a seam, scattering like salt onto the hides. The cold invades quickly, biting your cheeks before someone patches the gap. The longhouse is holding, but every shriek of the wind reminds you how thin the line island. Scholars disagree on whether storms like this weakened houses beyond repair. Some argue that regular patching made them last for decades, even generations. Others suggest that after only a few years, houses needed rebuilding entirely. Excavated sites show both long use and sudden abandonment, and the truth may be that resilience varied from house to house. What's clear is that storms like this one were tests, nightly exams where failure meant death. And yet amid fear there is also beauty. The fire throws sparks upward, and through a momentary opening in the roof vent, you glimpse snowflakes swirling down, caught in the glow like falling stars. The wind howls, but inside, you're cocooned in sound crackling wood, murmured prayers, low animal growls, all layered into a strange lullaby. The storm isn't just outside. It has seeped into the fabric of the longhouse, becoming part of the night's rhythm. You settle back, listening more closely. The whistle of the wind turns rhythmic, almost musical. The groaning beams creak in tempo with your heartbeat. The storm's chaos resolves itself into patterns unpredictable yet oddly soothing. You realize that to live here is to make peace with noise, to transform it into background, to hear in it not doom, but endurance. The bark shakes again, but you no longer flinch. The house growls, and you smile faintly, imagining it really is a living creature, hunched against the cold, protecting its people with every fibre. Outside, the world howls. Inside, the longhouse bends but does not break. And so you close your eyes once more, rocking gently with the storm's roar, letting its wild music lull you toward another uneasy but enduring sleep. The storm's roar eventually fades into a muffled hum, leaving the longhouse wrapped in eerie stillness. In that pause, you become more aware of the textures layered around you, the weight of hides, the mats beneath, the scratch of bark walls, the faint rasp of wool fibers. You notice how deliberately every surface has been arranged. Survival here is a matter of layers, not just in walls and roofs, but in how bodies, bedding, and clothing are stacked like Russian dolls of insulation. One thing ethnographers stress is that the people of the Longhouse mastered the art of layering. They wore inner garments of softened deerskin, topped with heavier robes of fur. At night, they didn't shed these, but slept in them, wrapping still more hides over the top. Mats of reeds or cattail stalks cushioned the bunks. Hides went on top of those, then cloaks, then blankets. Heat trapped in each layer stayed longer because it had to fight through barrier after barrier. It was survival by accumulation. A curious little detail emerges from Jesuit records. Some families even layered their shelters within the longhouse. Smaller mats or temporary partitions were hung around bunks, making mini cocoons that trapped warmth more efficiently than the open aisle. Imagine crawling into one now, pushing aside a hanging mat to slide into a space dense with furs, your breath bouncing back at you from the makeshift walls. Claustrophobic, perhaps, but warmer than the open air. Historians continue to discuss just how efficient these nesting strategies were. Some suggest they allowed longhouse interiors to maintain livable temperatures, despite frigid storms. Others argue the effect was minimal, more psychological than thermal. Reconstructions in modern museums produce mixed results. Some are stifling, others drafty no matter how many hides are hung. The lack of consensus leaves the truth hazy, but when you sink deeper into your bundle, you don't need measurements to feel its worth. The sensory dimension is unmistakable. You feel one layer cool to the touch while the one beneath remains toasty. You hear the muffled rustle of mats rubbing against hides, the creak of wood planks shifting beneath the weight. The smell is a mix of smoke-saturated fur, grassy reeds, and faint animal musk. The combination creates a microclimate, your own tiny cave nested within the larger wooden ribcage of the house. There's even a quirky twist in how people managed layers. Some stories describe families rotating hides during the night, flipping colder outer layers closer to the fire or laying new ones over children without waking them. Others mention people sleeping with extra garments piled on top like ad hoc quilts, not worn but simply spread across bodies. Everything that could trap heat was pressed into service. And it wasn't only textiles. Food storage baskets and tools hung overhead also became layers, buffering against drafts. Dogs curled atop bedding added another living layer. Even ash spread under bunks absorbed dampness and added insulation. The entire household functioned as one giant nesting doll, each piece contributing to the thermal puzzle. The layering extended to social life too. You notice how conversations at night soften as people drift into overlapping clusters. Elders murmur stories at one end, children giggle under hides at the other, couples whisper in low tones somewhere between. These voices form another insulation, a sound layer wrapping the longhouse in intimacy. Against the silence of snow outside, the noise inside is its own protective skin. Scholars debate whether these layering strategies were innovations developed gradually or long-standing traditions carried from ancestral homelands. Some argue they were responses to the particular climate of the northeast woodlands, refined with each generation. Others suggest the methods trace back centuries earlier, long before bark longhouses, to earlier forms of communal living. Without precise evidence, the question remains open, but the continuity of practice speaks for itself. A quirky aside, Modern reenactors who've tried sleeping in reconstructed longhouses describe waking up drenched in sweat despite freezing temperatures outside. They joke that the hardest part isn't keeping warm but escaping overheating once you're swaddled in too many layers. It's a reminder that survival here wasn't about comfort balance. It was about ensuring that freezing to death was never an option, even if it meant sweating under furs. As you adjust your own hides, you realize that layering isn't just survival technique, it's metaphor. Each layer represents another piece of community effort. Hunters bringing hides, women weaving mats, children stuffing reeds, traders exchanging cloth. Warmth is communal, stacked together from countless contributions, each one as vital as the next. You sink back into the pile, the outer layers stiff and smoky, the inner ones soft and warm, your body heat caught between. Outside, snow falls in endless layers on the forest, each flake indistinguishable but together forming mountains. Inside, you mirror that strategy, insulating, accumulating, turning fragility into strength. And as your eyes close again, you realize this is the essence of longhouse survival. Never relying on one single defense, but always layering, always stacking, until the cold, however relentless, is slowed enough for you to drift into dreams. The longhouse lies quiet except for the soft rhythm of sleepers and the occasional bark from a dog at the entrance. You think the space is already full, pressed shoulder to shoulder with kin, but then the door flap stirs. A blast of icy air slices in, and two figures stoop low, shaking snow from their cloaks. Travelers have arrived, late in the night, seeking refuge. Ethnographers agree on one point. Longhouses were not just family shelters, but also community inns of sorts. Guests, traders, messengers, or relatives from other villages could be welcomed inside, no matter how crowded the bunks already seemed. Hospitality was survival. To turn someone away in midwinter was to condemn them, and the ethic of shared warmth extended beyond immediate kin. A vivid little detail comes from a Dutch trader's notes. He described entering a longhouse so packed that he wondered if there was room for even a mouse, only to be shown a space cleared near a fire where he could lay his cloak. The family didn't complain. They made room because that was what the house demanded. You can almost see the shuffle of bodies now, hides pulled tighter, elbows tucked in, everyone adjusting to fit the newcomers. Of course, scholars debate how seamless this hospitality always was. Some argue that protocol governed guest treatment, certain clans had obligations to host, others expected reciprocity later. Others believe it was more ad hoc, guided by circumstance rather than strict rule. Archaeological traces don't reveal etiquette, so the question lingers in the smoky air of speculation. What's clear, though, is that space was elastic. The longhouse expanded not in walls but in generosity. The sensory impact of new arrivals is immediate. The flap falls shut behind them, but the cold they carried in lingers, making your skin prickle. Their cloaks drip onto mats, releasing the sharp metallic scent of snow and ice. Their breath steams in great clouds as they settle, and dogs stir, sniffing strangers before curling back to sleep. Within moments, the travelers are absorbed, their voices blending with the soft hum of the household. Sometimes guests brought gifts, food, tools, news of distant kin. These offerings were practical, but they also eased the strain of extra mouths. A pouch of dried berries passed around the hearth, a fresh bundle of firewood laid down by the wall. These were tokens that transformed intrusion into contribution. You can picture the quiet gratitude as a family shares a new flavor in the stew, the warmth of both fire and generosity spreading together. A quirky aside surfaces in oral stories. Children sometimes teased travelers by asking whether they snored, joking that space was tight enough without loud sleep. The humor disguised real tension. Every new sleeper meant more crowding, more body heat, but also more noise. Still, the teasing itself shows how normalized such visits were. Guests weren't extraordinary, they were expected. But scholars question how welcome those guests always felt. Was there resentment at losing personal space, at pressing tighter under hides? Did quarrels spark over who shared which bunk? Some suggest that longhouses, while communal, were also fraught with subtle politics, and adding outsiders could tip balances. Others argue that the ethic of generosity overrode such concerns, with harmony prized over complaint. As with many elements of longhouse life, the truth lies in shades rather than absolutes. The soundscape shifts with travelers present. New voices murmur in strange dialects. Stories of distant villages ripple through the chamber. Children whisper questions about where they came from. Elders nod solemnly, weighing the news. Gossip and information ride the same fires that cook meals and warm hands. The longhouse becomes not just shelter but also forum, expanding beyond its bark walls into a network of villages and nations. You notice how quickly the cold brought in by the guests is erased. Within minutes, their bodies add to the collective furnace, more coals in the human fire. What began as intrusion turns into reinforcement. The irony is clear. The more crowded the house, the warmer it becomes. The discomfort of less space is traded for the comfort of more heat. A symbolic reading emerges here. The longhouse is more than a building. It is a lesson in community. To survive the night, you don't hoard warmth. You share it. You open your flap even when your bed is already full. The reward is not just survival for the guest, but survival for the group. For tomorrow the roles might be reversed, and you might be the one stumbling in from snow. The flap stirs again as the wind tugs, and you feel the faintest draft. But now, with the newcomers tucked into place, the air feels thicker, warmer, more alive. The longhouse has accepted them, and in doing so, grown stronger. You pull your hides closer and drift back towards sleep, comforted by the thought that survival here is never solitary. It is a gift passed back and forth, traveller to host, night after night. The longhouse is never truly still, but the busiest moments often come just before dawn. Tonight, you stir to the muffled thuds of feet and the soft scrape of tools against wood. It isn't feasting time, nor storytelling time. It's the quiet labor of keeping everything inside from slipping into ruin. You realize that while most sleep, some always tend, repairing, adjusting, maintaining the fragile balance that keeps everyone alive. Archaeological findings support this constant upkeep. Excavated longhouse sites reveal repeated layers of patchwork moss stuffed deeper into seams, poles replaced in haste, hearths rebuilt over and over. The structure wasn't a frozen monument. It was a living thing, continuously nursed into stability. You feel it now as someone moves along the wall, pushing reeds into a gap where cold breathes through, their hands rough but steady. Without such work, even one bad night could break the system. Here's a peculiar detail from oral accounts. Certain tasks were carried out in the near dark to avoid letting cold flood in through open flaps. People preferred to patch from within, layering moss or hides against drafts, while relying only on the fire's glow. Imagine the patience required to work by touch, fingers hunting for cracks while smoke stings your eyes. The house was cared for even while most of its residents lay snoring under hides. Scholars continue to argue about how much of this upkeep was daily routine versus seasonal overhaul. Some suggest winter nights were mostly for minor fixes, with major repairs delayed until thaw. Others believe large-scale adjustments, even shifting poles, were done midwinter if collapse threatened. Without direct records, the answer is debated, but all agree that vigilance never ceased. Survival meant treating maintenance as ritual. The sensory palette tells you everything. You hear the faint squeak of wood being wedged into place, the hiss of snow shaken off hides, the muffled cough of someone working near smoke. You smell damp moss freshly torn, its forest scent intruding into the smoky chamber. You feel the subtle shift of air as cracks are sealed, drafts replaced by steady warmth. Each small adjustment reshapes the atmosphere of the house, pulling it back from the edge of collapse. Sometimes this maintenance became communal drama. A quirky aside mentions that when a major leak appeared, say, a flap torn free in a storm, the entire household might rise in the night to fix it together. Children held poles steady, elders muttered advice, adults worked furiously with knives and lashings. The longhouse echoed with urgency, every hand contributing. The memory of such nights lingered for years, retold with laughter once the danger had passed. Remember the night we patched the roof with that broken canoe paddle? Someone might chuckle around future fires. But beneath the humour lay anxiety. Scholars debate whether fear of sudden collapse was exaggerated by outsiders or genuinely ever present. Some reconstructions suggest longhouses could endure storms easily. Others show roofs sagging alarmingly under snow. The truth, as always, likely varied. Some houses held strong for decades. Others groaned and demanded near-constant nursing. Either way, the nightly routine of checking, patching, and adjusting was insurance against catastrophe. The symbolic weight of this labour is striking. Children grew up watching elders patch seams, learning that warmth didn't simply exist, it was built and rebuilt, constantly earned. Each crack sealed was a lesson. Survival is maintenance, not miracle. You roll under your hides and think of how different it is from your world, where heating hums invisibly. Here, warmth has a sound, a smell, a rhythm of labour that never stops. You picture a man crouched by the hearth, raking ashes carefully so embers will last until dawn. Another kneels at the wall, stuffing moss with practiced speed. A woman flips damp hides near the fire, muttering at their stubborn weight. None of this is glamorous, none of it new, but each task keeps the line between warmth and frost from collapsing. The longhouse survives because its people refuse to rest fully, because someone always tends. And in that realization, you feel a deeper comfort. Warmth here isn't luck, it's intention, persistence, the sum of countless small acts done in smoke and darkness. You curl tighter into your bedding, listening to the quiet repairs continuing, and let yourself relax. The house groans, the storm whispers, but the people inside work on. And because they work, you can sleep. The faint glow of morning never truly reaches inside the longhouse, but you can sense the shift. The embers are stirred, smoke holes are widened, and the air, though still heavy, grows more breathable. People are moving with purpose now, not to repair or to huddle, but to prepare for the day ahead. The secret of survival is not just in enduring the night, it is in building habits that make tomorrow possible. One point nearly every historian agrees on is that longhouse communities lived by rhythm: fire tending, food storage, bedding rotation, hide drying, moss stuffing. These weren't random acts. They were schedules, rituals, practiced so consistently that the routines themselves became as reliable as the walls. You feel it in the way bodies rise without being called, in the way tools appear at the right moment, in the way no one argues about what comes next. A curious detail emerges from oral accounts. Families sometimes assigned each person a particular night watch role. One child fetched small sticks to revive the fire. A teenager checked for leaks along the wall. An elder sat awake longer than others, listening for drafts or intruders. These roles were passed down like heirlooms, each child growing into responsibility as naturally as learning to walk. Imagine the pride of being told, "Tonight, you guard the embers." The warmth of the entire family rested in your small hands. Scholars debate how much of this structure was rigid and how much was flexible. Some argue clans had strict expectations about who performed what tasks. Others suggest the system was more fluid, with everyone pitching in wherever needed. Excavations and records provide little clarity, leaving only the impression of households that balanced discipline with adaptation. You realize that survival wasn't about rigid rules or chaos, it was about harmony, an ongoing negotiation between structure and spontaneity. The sensory texture of these routines is vivid. You hear the scraping of wooden ladles as breakfast stews are stirred, their steam softening the stale chill. You smell damp hides hung closer to the fire, pungent but slowly sweetening as smoke dries them. You feel the bump of bodies weaving around you, each movement purposeful, practiced. Even in semi-darkness, the space pulses with activity like a hive, each member fulfilling their part. Here's a quirky aside. Some accounts note that mornings in the Longhouse were filled with joking competitions about who had slept the worst. People teased one another about snoring, about shoving elbows, about hiding all the good furs. The complaints were playful, diffusing real frustrations of cramped quarters. Laughter became another ritual, a way of shrugging off discomfort and turning it into story. "You nearly pushed me onto the floor," someone jokes, while handing that same cousin a ladle of steaming broth. But survival routines weren't all cheerful. They also carried weight. Firewood inventories had to be checked, water brought in before ice sealed the streams, moss gathered in anticipation of more drafts. Neglect wasn't just laziness, it was danger. Scholars differ on whether these chores were driven more by communal discipline or by sheer necessity. Either way, no one could opt out for long. The house remembered neglect, in drafts, in hunger, in colder nights. The symbolism of this daily cycle is powerful. The Longhouse wasn't merely a shelter, it was a machine powered by cooperation. Fires didn't burn without woodcutters, stews didn't steam without gatherers, hides didn't dry without careful tending. Warmth itself was a communal invention, renewed every day by dozens of hands. You realize, listening to the quiet bustle, that comfort was never taken for granted. It was manufactured, piece by piece, habit by habit. A sensory moment lingers as you sip broth from a bowl passed your way. It tastes smoky, earthy, with a faint sweetness from dried squash. The warmth spreads through your chest, and suddenly all the labor of the morning makes sense. Each habit, each task, is fuel. Fuel for the body, fuel for the fire, fuel for the will to face another frozen day. You glance around at the faces lit by firelight and realize the house itself teaches discipline. The cold punishes forgetfulness instantly. Skip a chore, and frost creeps in. Fail to stoke the fire, and the air chills. Neglect moss stuffing, and drafts bite through hides. The environment is unforgiving, but because of that, the people become meticulous. The Longhouse isn't just a shelter, it's a teacher, one that demands attentiveness and rewards diligence with survival. As you pull the hide tighter around your shoulders, you feel the warmth of food, the weight of routine, and the trust in those around you. The night may have been long, but the day has been prepared for. And tonight, when the storm returns, the household will meet it again, not with panic, but with rhythm, with labor, with rituals repeated so often they feel like second nature. You close your eyes briefly, listening to the scrape of ladles, the crackle of logs, the murmur of voices, and realize the most enduring insulation of all isn't moss or hide or ash, it's habit. The relentless, steady choreography of people who never stop tending to one another, and to the fragile walls that keep death at bay. You feel the air shift as morning fully asserts itself. The Longhouse is not a place where people sleep late. The rhythm of survival pulls everyone upright. Fires roar again. Dogs shake themselves awake. And already the talk turns to what must be done beyond the smoky walls. Winter nights are endured inside, but days demand venture outside, into the sharp white world. One thing archaeologists and historians alike agree upon is that Longhouse life required balance between indoor endurance and outdoor labor. No matter how well the fire burned, no matter how thick the hides, families had to leave the cocoon. Hunting, hauling water, splitting more wood, gathering reeds or herbs even in midwinter, the tasks continued. You can imagine the shiver that runs through the house when someone pulls back the flap and a blast of snow-scented air invades the warmth. A curious little note comes from missionary journals. They remarked at how quickly native men and women adjusted between the extremes. One moment pressed shoulder to shoulder under furs, the next trudging waist-deep in snow, axes or sleds in hand. Children too learned this rhythm early, chasing dogs into the white glare, only to return red-cheeked and steaming, greeted by scolding elders with hides ready to bundle them again. Life was a pendulum, swinging constantly between firelit survival and frostbitten labor. Scholars still dispute how much time was actually spent outdoors in the coldest months. Some argue that families planned so well that winters were largely spent inside, emerging only when necessary. Others believe daily excursions were unavoidable as stores dwindled and repairs demanded attention. Both views hold weight, but the truth may be somewhere between. A longhouse was refuge, not prison, and survival meant constant dialogue with the outside world. The sensory contrast is jarring. Step outside, and the air slashes your lungs, crisp and metallic. Snow blinds with its brightness, crunching underfoot with a squeak that echoes through the forest. Step back inside, and the smoke hugs you, warmth pressing close, your eyes watering from the sudden shift. To live here is to toggle constantly between two climates, each harsh in its own way. Here's a quirky aside. Some accounts describe families deliberately cooling themselves outdoors before crawling back under furs, believing the shock made the indoor warmth feel sweeter. Children laughed through it, treating the dash into snow as a dare, tumbling back in shrieking as dogs shook frost onto them. Outsiders thought it madness. Insiders knew it was morale. But the outdoor ventures were serious. Hunting in winter required not just skill but endurance. Men tracked deer across snow, sometimes for days, returning exhausted but triumphant, with meat that meant life for dozens. Women cut firewood and hauled heavy baskets of reeds, their breath misting in the frigid air. Children fetched water through holes cut in frozen rivers, their small hands chapped raw but steady. Each return to the longhouse was more than relief. It was victory, proof that the bond between human and land held firm. Scholars debate whether these daily outings weakened or strengthened survival odds. Some argue the energy spent outdoors was dangerous, burning more calories than the food gathered provided. Others counter that without constant foraging and wood gathering, the house would have frozen or starved. Archaeological evidence of middens filled with winter hunting remains suggests activity persisted, though exactly how much remains unsettled. Inside, you feel the echoes of those excursions. When someone returns, the longhouse changes. Snow-streaked hides hang near the fire, steaming and dripping. Dogs leap joyfully, shaking powder onto mats. The smell of raw meat mingles with smoke, promising fresh stew. Children cluster, eager for stories of what was seen outside: deer trails, wolf howls, broken trees heavy with snow. The longhouse, for all its insulation, never forgets the wilderness. It enters with every returning step. Symbolically, this back and forth is vital. The longhouse teaches that survival isn't about hiding from the world but engaging with it, then retreating wisely. The bark walls are not boundaries but membranes, porous and alive. Cold rushes in, warmth rushes out, and families learn to move with the flow rather than fight it. The sensory rhythm soothes you. The squeal of snow outside fades into the crackle of fire within. The smell of pine sap carried in on cloaks dissolves into the musk of hides. Your skin tingles from sudden drafts, then relaxes as furs reclaim you. Each oscillation reminds you that comfort is fleeting, but renewal is constant. As you burrow back into your bedding, you think about this pendulum life. Warmth is not a permanent state, but a reward, earned each time someone steps into the snow and returns. The longhouse is not a fortress, but a dock, tethering its people to the storm beyond. And you, snug once more under your layered cocoon, feel grateful that when the flap opens again tomorrow, someone else will step into the white glare, so that warmth inside can continue one night longer. You awaken to the low hum of conversation, not frantic like during a storm, but steady, rhythmic, almost soothing. It takes a moment to realize what you're hearing. People are talking not about firewood or hunting or patching seams, but about memory. Winter nights in the longhouse weren't filled only with chores and sleep. They were seasons of storytelling, the passing of knowledge from mouth to mouth, ear to ear. Warmth came not just from flames, but from words that bound generations together. Observers often noted this practice with awe. In the months when snow shut the world outside, families turned inward, weaving tales by firelight. Elders recounted origin myths, histories of clans, lessons from past winters. Each retelling wasn't just entertainment, it was insurance. Knowledge embedded in story carried survival strategies. Which herbs eased fever, where to find deer when snow lay deepest, how to read stars when paths vanished. You listen now and hear how wisdom slips seamlessly into narrative, disguised as adventure, song, or fable. Here's a curious little detail. Some nations considered winter the only proper season for certain sacred stories. To tell them in summer, when fields demanded labor, was disrespectful or even dangerous. But in the smoky stillness of the Longhouse, with the outside world frozen, the stories could flow freely, unhurried. Imagine children waiting all year for these tales, their eyes wide in the flicker of flames, their bodies pressed under hides, while their minds soared into myth. Scholars still debate how much of this storytelling was strictly ritual versus casual. Some argue winter nights were highly structured, with elders holding the floor while others listened in silence. Others believe the atmosphere was more fluid, stories mingling with laughter, teasing, and spontaneous songs. Archaeological evidence can't answer, leaving only the written impressions of outsiders, many of whom misunderstood what they witnessed. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, ritual and play interwoven, like bark and moss in the walls. The sensory landscape is unforgettable. The fire pops, punctuating the cadence of a tale. Smoke shifts with each draft, veiling faces until they look half human, half spirit. A child's gasp at a surprising twist cuts through the stillness, followed by a ripple of chuckles. You smell sage tossed into the fire for emphasis, its fragrance sharp against the musk of hides. Every sense confirms that story is not just heard here, it's lived. A quirky aside appears in oral accounts. Children sometimes acted out stories with exaggerated gestures, earning laughter when they stumbled into mats or knocked over baskets. Elders encouraged it, turning learning into play. You can almost see a boy leaping to mimic a hunter, his arms flailing, before collapsing in giggles onto his cousin. What might seem chaos to an outsider was in fact rehearsal practice in embodying history so it would be carried forward. The debates among scholars extend further. Was storytelling primarily entertainment to distract from cold, or was it a deeply pragmatic method of teaching? Some say both, arguing that entertainment itself was a survival tool, lifting spirits in months when despair could creep in like frost. Others insist the lessons encoded in story about land, animals, ancestors were the true purpose. Listening to the voices around you now, you realize the categories don't matter. What matters is how the words warm, how they knit community tighter than any hide. You lean back against a post, eyes half closed, letting the murmur wash over you. The rhythm of voices rises and falls like waves, carrying you into drowsiness. For a moment you feel as though the stories themselves are blankets, layered around you, trapping heat, keeping cold at bay. Perhaps that was always their hidden power, not just to teach or entertain, but to soothe, to calm the restless body into rest despite drafts and fleas and storms. The symbolic weight of it becomes clear. Fire provided heat, hides provided insulation, but stories provided purpose. Without them, the Longhouse would be a smoky prison. With them, it became a theatre of endurance, a place where imagination carried people beyond their frozen walls. Survival is never only physical, it's emotional, spiritual, cultural. Storytelling kept hearts alive so bodies would keep fighting. As the tale winds down, a hush settles, broken only by the crackle of embers. Children yawn, dogs sigh, elders lean back, their silhouettes softened by smoke. You close your eyes, warmed not only by hides and fire, but by the voices still echoing in your ears. The storm outside may still claw at the bark, but inside, words have built a second longhouse, one invisible, made of memory and meaning, just as strong as poles and bark. You drift into sleep with that thought, realizing that warmth is more than a condition. It is a story you carry forward, layer by layer, until even the longest winter bends beneath it. The longhouse has quieted again, though the glow of embers still paints the walls in a faint orange haze. You stir beneath your layers and notice the way bodies press even closer now. The house feels fuller than before, not with guests this time, but with a deliberate act of clustering. Winter nights, especially in the hardest stretch of February, weren't endured in loose scatterings. They were survived by drawing the household into tighter knots, sleeping almost as a single living body. Anthropologists often highlight this practice of heat clustering. Families didn't just share bunks, they overlapped, rotated, and bundled together deliberately, maximizing skin-to-skin warmth. Infants nestled between parents, elders leaned against grown children, and cousins crowded shoulder to shoulder. It was a nightly equation of survival, recalculated with each shift and cough. When you lie here now, ribs pressed into a neighbor's back, it feels less like inconvenience and more like necessity. A curious detail appears in oral recollections. People joked that the longhouse turned into a sleeping snake at night, bodies coiled in rows, curling and unwinding as drafts forced adjustment. Children laughed at the metaphor, wriggling under hides as though they truly were a giant serpent shedding and reshaping. What might seem claustrophobic became, through humor, a shared identity. The longhouse wasn't dozens of individuals, it was one organism, warming itself against the snow. Scholars still disagree on how comfortable this clustering really was. Some suggest the warmth was almost unbearable at times, leading to sweaty, restless nights. Others argue that drafts and moisture made the press of bodies barely sufficient, with sleep always half broken. Modern reenactors who try the practice report both extremes, one night sweltering, the next shivering. The truth likely shifted as unpredictably as the weather outside. The sensory dimension is immediate. You feel the weight of another's arm across your chest, the damp heat of breath against your neck, the sharp edge of a knee pressing into your hip. Every sound is amplified in closeness. The wheeze of an elder's lungs, the whimper of a child's dream, the soft grunt of a dog shifting at your feet. Privacy dissolves into warmth, and you surrender to the idea that survival matters more than solitude. There's a quirky aside that outsiders often recorded with surprise. Some households even slept with chickens or other small animals tucked under hides, not as pets, but as living heaters. The birds quieted in the dark, their warmth bleeding into the pile of bodies. It might seem absurd to modern ears, but in a world without down comforters, every feathered ounce of warmth counted. You can almost feel a hen shifting beside your ankle now, its soft cluck reminding you that warmth was a collective project, species boundaries blurred. This nightly crowding wasn't just physical, it carried social weight. Who slept beside whom revealed kinship, ties, trust, and sometimes political alliances. Being pulled into the center meant safety and esteem. Being left on the drafty edge could sting with more than cold. Scholars debate whether this arrangement shifted with circumstance or remained fixed, but all agree it reflected the social fabric as much as the thermal one. To be wrapped in the middle was both comfort and recognition. Yet conflict inevitably surfaced. Someone snored too loudly. Someone hogged the thickest hide. Someone elbowed a cousin too many times. Quarrels muttered in the night, only to dissolve in laughter or chores come morning. The longhouse tolerated friction because survival demanded it. Cold didn't care if you disliked your neighbor. You still needed their warmth. The symbolic lesson of clustering runs deep. It shows how vulnerability reshaped hierarchy. The strong protected the weak, but also leaned on them for comfort. Infants, who generated little heat, still anchored families with their presence. Elders, though frail, provided the steady weight of experience. In the dark, pressed so close that boundaries blurred, everyone became part of the same human quilt. The storm outside groans faintly, but you hardly notice anymore. You are enveloped in layers of hide, yes, but also in layers of flesh and trust. Your body heat is not your own, it mingles with those around you, rising in a collective haze that the cold cannot easily penetrate. As you close your eyes again, you realize the profound truth. Survival in the Longhouse wasn't about building individual cocoons. It was about surrendering to the group, allowing your warmth to merge with theirs, until the line between you and the community dissolved. The cold outside could never understand this secret. But inside, pressed together like scales of the same snake, you drift into slumber, alive, because togetherness itself is the blanket. The Longhouse exhales quietly as night deepens again. Fires have been fed, hides adjusted, children soothed. You lie in the haze of warmth and smoke, listening to the steady rhythm of sleep all around. By now you understand that every detail, the bark walls, the moss in the seams, the layering of hides, the clustering of bodies, the endless tending of fire is part of a system honed over centuries. Still, you feel the need to reflect, to gather these fragments into a single picture before dawn arrives. Archaeologists and historians agree on one undeniable fact. People endured winters in these structures for generations. That alone proves their effectiveness. Longhouses may not have been comfortable by modern standards, but they worked. Layered bark and insulation trapped heat, hearths produced warmth and smoke for preservation, and careful daily maintenance kept collapse at bay. The proof lies in survival itself. Communities thrived, raised children, and told stories through countless winters without succumbing to the cold. And yet, there are quirky details that remind you survival was never neat. Drips of condensation fell like indoor rain. Fleas and lice turned bedding into battlefields. Dogs stole prime spots by the fire. Chickens squawked beneath hides. The Longhouse was as much a menagerie as a home. Outsiders sometimes mocked these inconveniences, but those who lived inside knew the truth. Imperfection did not equal failure. You could itch, cough, and still live to see spring. Scholars continue to argue over how warm the interiors truly were. Some reconstructions suggest temperatures hovered only just above freezing, enough to prevent death, but never enough to mimic comfort. Others record interiors where the heat became stifling, with smoke so dense, visitors stumbled out gasping. The debate remains unsettled, and perhaps that is fitting. The experience likely varied nightly, even hourly, depending on the storm outside, the size of the fire, the discipline of the household. Warmth here was never static. It was a shifting negotiation with the elements. The sensory imprint is unforgettable. The creak of bark panels bending under snow, the scent of cedar and sage smouldering with smoke, the rough feel of deer hide pressed against your cheek, oily and warm, the sound of breath in unison, rising like mist toward the rafters, the sight of sparks slipping through smoke holes into the starry dark. Even the discomforts, the drip of moisture, the scratch of pests, the cough from heavy haze become part of a larger texture. Together, they form the tapestry of endurance. A quirky aside worth remembering. Some accounts claim people deliberately allowed snow to pile against the outer walls, turning storms into allies. The drifts acted as extra insulation, muffling the wind and sealing cracks. What seemed like danger became protection. You smile at the ingenuity, taking what threatened to bury you and making it part of your defense. That spirit of adaptation, of bending hardship into help, is the essence of Longhouse survival. Symbolically, the Longhouse itself is a teacher. It reminds you that warmth isn't given, it is made. It demands cooperation. Wood split, moss gathered, food cooked, stories told, hides shared. It insists that survival is communal, not individual. Alone, no one could endure the drafts and storms. Together, pressed body to body, generation to generation, people not only survived, but built societies rich with ceremony, humor, and resilience. Now the night is nearly done. You feel the weight of furs, the heat of clustered bodies, the ember glow pulsing steadily. Outside, snow still falls, But it no longer feels menacing. The house has proven itself again, holding strong through another winter night. You breathe deeply, grateful for the ingenuity that turned bark, moss, smoke, and story into an architecture of survival. And as sleep finally claims you, you carry one last thought. The cold never vanished. It pressed at the walls all night, sharp and insistent. But it was slowed, softened, blunted not by one miracle, but by 1,000 small acts woven together. That, more than anything, is how Native Americans slept in longhouses without freezing to death. And now, as our journey through the smoky rafters and crowded bunks of the longhouse comes to a close, it's time to let go of detail and settle into softness. You can picture the final embers glowing like sleepy eyes, the last crackle of wood folding into silence. The storm outside no longer rattles. It muffles itself in snowdrifts, distant, softened, as if even winter has grown tired. Your body is heavy beneath the layered hides. The warmth, hard-earned through fire and breath and closeness, wraps you like a cocoon. You don't need to think of moss seams or firewood piles now. You don't need to count the drips from the roof or scratch at the occasional tickle. All of that fades into the background. What remains is the steady rhythm of life breath rising and falling, hearts beating quietly in the dark, community holding itself together against the night. Let your mind drift to the rafters where tools and food hang in stillness, preserved by smoke. Imagine the soft rustle of feathers from a bird tucked beneath hides, the gentle sigh of a dog shifting closer to your feet. Every sound is muted, softened by time, wrapped in haze. Even the air feels gentle now. The smoke that once stung has thinned to a pale veil, a gauze that filters firelight into a dreamlike glow. It blurs the edges of everything until the longhouse itself seems to float less a structure of bark and pole, more a cradle suspended between earth and sky. So breathe slowly, deeply, and let the story dissolve into warmth. Outside, winter waits. Inside, you are safe, wrapped in layers of ingenuity and care. Close your eyes, rest easy. The long night has been endured.